Hello guys, welcome back to my channel. As you can see in the picture today, let's start the story of What If Issei Was Devil Among Devils Season 2 Part 2, Chapter 16. Come now, Chiho, Rias urged as she took a sip of her tea. We went over this. It was the final day of their training camp, and after a hard day's training, the crimson-haired girl had given her peerage the rest of the night off to rest. She and her servants were currently seated around the sitting room with the three fallen angels, while Issei's servants took care of dinner. Issei himself had been bound and gagged inside the dining room. It was probably for the best. In the meantime, Rias had decided to utilize the remaining time they had to teach Chiho and Asia the basic knowledge they needed in the underworld. The main governing body of the fallen angels is called the Grigori, Kalloiner told her. Can you name any of its leaders? Well, I can only remember two of them completely, the brown-haired girl muttered. There's Azazel, the Governor-General, and Shamaze, the Vice-Governor-General. There are others, Arm Rose, Baraquel, Tamalby, Something and Cocaine. Venemu, Kakabil and Sheriel, the blue-haired fallen angel, corrected her. Please memorize them properly. This is basic stuff. It's the same as knowing the Prime Minister and Vice Prime Minister of Japan, as well as the leaders of the surrounding countries. There's too many. Chiho exclaimed with a huff. 2 is enough. What do those other leaders do anyway? Well, Amuro-sama is the head researcher of anti-magic. Yuma began listing them off. Sahiro-sama is the head researcher of the moon and its effects on the supernatural. Penema-sama is the chief secretary. Okay, never mind, the brunette said quickly, prompting the fallen angel to smirk at her. Moving on, Ria said. Can you name the leaders of hell, past and present? Oh, I know the current ones, Chiho offered. Serapho Leviathan-sama, Falbium Asmatia-sama, Ajuka Beelzebub-sama and Sergic as Lucifer-sama. Good, the crimson-haired girl smiled. Now can you name our original leaders? The brunette chuckled nervously. Kind of. I know the original versions of the ones I just listed. There's also Belphegoram, Mammy, and or Satan, Sama, Ria sighed, rubbing the bridge of her nose. If you're going to remember anything, please remember that not knowing his name or getting it wrong like you did with Mammon Sama will quickly earn you the ire of most devils, especially the elders who knew him in life. Even after all this time, you devils still revere him like that? Middle questioned, earning herself an alarmed glance from her fellow fallen angels. The blonde merely grinned at them cheekily. Yes, we do, the crimson-haired girl nodded. In fact, it wouldn't be a stretch to say that he is our god. You'd go that far? Kalloiner asked, shocked. I realize he was your king, but he was far more than a simple king, Ria said sharply. He was the progenitor of our entire race. He created the Mayo and the 72 pillars, gifting them with the blood of the devil. It is said that he bestowed each of the pillars with one of his own abilities. Kiba added his own knowledge. Abilities such as the Baal's power of destruction and the Phoenix's regeneration. These abilities are cherished by the devils and are seen as a sign of his favor. Unfortunately, this is also why there is so much elitism among the pillars, Riaz continued. We're called pure-blooded because we gained our devilhood from Satan-sama himself, whereas other devils were created by proxy of the other male or were reincarnated from other races. The crimson-haired girl let out a sigh. And it's also why my family is so insistent on this marriage, she said wearily. To ensure the survival of the pillars and our king's gifts. The room fell silent, as no one was sure what to say next. Ria's servants were sending her looks of concern, while the three fallen angels merely glanced at each other awkwardly. Finally, Ria shook her head and smiled. Let's move on, shall we? She spoke up, breaking the somewhat awkward silence that had descended on them. The Gremry heiress turned to Chiho once again. We left off with the 7 male, correct? Last would be our greatest foe, the angels of heaven. Can you name their leaders? Oh, Asia exclaimed, raising her hand excitedly. May I answer this one, but you? Briaz let out a small giggle at her servant's enthusiasm. Very well, she conceded, smiling when Chiho let out a relieved sigh. Please enlighten our friend, Asia. The former nun actually stood and walked to the front of the room as though she were about to give a lecture, much to the amusement of her fellow servants. Heaven is led by the Holy Father, she told them, pulling out a pair of reading glasses and slipping them onto her face. He sits atop the throne of heaven and watches over his children. The throne is guarded by the seraphim, the purest and most powerful of God's angels. There are 10 seraphim in total and are led by the 4 archangels, Michael, Raphael, Uriel, and Gabriel. Riaz chuckled. You really worship them, don't you? The blonde nodded, an embarrassed flush on her face at being caught rambling. I used to read about them in the Bible every day, Asia said, a slightly saddened look on her face. But now, I can't even get through a single verse without getting a headache. As though to demonstrate, the nun rushed to her seat, whereupon sat a small backpack. Opening the pack, she retrieved a copy of the Holy Bible. Flipping the book open, Asia found the verse she was looking for and opened her mouth to read aloud, only to cry out as a spike of pain erupted in her head. Moo, the blonde let out a pained moan. I just wanted to read this verse about Gabriel, it was my favorite. That's only natural, Ria said, once again taking a sip of her tea. You're a devil now, Asia. Reading God's words is akin to stabbing yourself in the eye. I'm actually surprised that you can even hold the Bible. So I'll never be able to read it again? Asia asked, a heartbroken expression on her face. Riaz flinched at the expression and eyed the girl sympathetically. I'm sorry, Asia, the redhead muttered. In exchange, why don't I tell you a story? You said that you liked a verse about Gabriel, right? She was my favorite seraph, Asia said sheepishly, eyeing Riaz curiously. Do you know any stories about her but you? The crimson-haired girl chuckled. I most certainly do, she nodded. She happens to be the only angel that is popular among the devils and is featured in a very popular children's tale. Middle traced an eyebrow at her. An angel that's popular with devils. She shook her head. What's this world coming to? Ria smiled. Well, she's known as the most beautiful woman in heaven, she reasoned. But it also helps that this particular story involves our king as well. Satan-sama? Chiho asked curiously. Indeed, Ria said with a wink. It's a tale of forbidden love. Her statement was met with choking sounds from the fallen angels. Love? Middle demanded incredulously, glancing at you out of the corner of her eye. The black-haired angel had frozen. Her stare was set on Riaz, unblinking. Long ago, during the final years of the Great War, the Archangel Gabriel descended to Earth to meet with the Demon King, the crimson-haired girl began. As you can probably surmise, there would have been opposition on both sides, so their meeting was kept secret even from God and the other man. Now, as you probably know, Gabriel is the angel of kindness, Riaz continued. She told him of her dream, a world without violence and hatred, a world where their factions could live together in peace. At first, he was simply amused by her naivety, and told her that peace could not exist between heaven and hell. She had expected this, however, and merely asked to meet with him again. He indulged her, and the two met again several days later. It was then that Gabriel asked him what his dream for the future was. Satan-sama was taken aback by her question. He thought for several moments before admitting that he did not have a dream. Gabriel smiled and asked that he continue to return to their meeting spot until he had a dream. And so he did. Every few days he would return to their meeting spot to find Gabriel awaiting him. Every time he did not return to her with a dream, they would sit together and talk. And though he refused to admit it, he found her presence to be comforting. She was kind, pure, and compassionate. She offered him empathy and trust without prejudice or resentment. In a world of darkness and deceit, she was his light. In return, Gabriel discovered that behind his cold and stony exterior was a man that was just as kind and compassionate as she was. She discovered that he was a man who loved his people and that all his actions, no matter how blasphemous they may seem in heaven's eyes, were always to protect his people. She learned that darkness could be just as noble and good, if not more so than light. They spent years together learning of the other's faction as well as each other. One day, he asked Gabriel if her dream was unchanged. When she answered the affirmative, he merely smiled. Satan-sama told her that he'd finally found a dream worth fighting for. Gabriel had shown him that there could be peace. Riaz said. He swore to her that he would fulfill her dream, but that was not all. I, too, wish for a world without war, he told her. But such a world is meaningless without you there at my side. He proposed to her. Asia exclaimed, "That's so romantic," Chiho sighed dreamily. Romantic? Middle trolled her eyes. More like cheesy. Well, it's little more than a fairy tale, Riaz chuckled. While it's true that Satan-sama and Gabriel were meeting in secret, what actually happened is unknown. Al Werner, however, kept her eyes on Yuma. The black-haired girl didn't seem to be registering anything they were saying and was staring vacantly into space, a frown on her face. And what happened next? The blue-haired fallen angel questioned, still watching her friend through the corner of her eye. Obviously, it didn't end happily ever after. Riaz frowned. I'm afraid the story has a much more tragic ending than I would care for, she admitted. Gabriel smiled at him, and they agreed to marry after the war's conclusion. What happened? Are you sure you want me to continue? Riaz questioned, looking at Asia in particular. When all she got were expectant stares, she relented. Leviathan happened, the redhead sighed. She had noticed that Satan-sama disappeared every few days and followed him. You can probably guess what happens next. Leviathan represents envy, Akino explained. And she envied Gabriel. She envied her beauty, her popularity, and most of all she envied her for stealing our king's heart. In her jealousy, she betrayed our king by going to heaven and framing Gabriel for treason, Ria said with a frown. Gabriel was apprehended by her fellow angels and was sentenced to death. Be death. Asia whimpered. But she's still alive, right? Indeed she is, Ria said, because our king did the unthinkable. He tore down heaven's gates, destroying anything and everything that got in his way. I know this part, Kellerner said, her eyes widening in realization. It was the worst attack heaven ever suffered. It sparked the final series of battles in the war, they called it Blue Night, the redhead nodded. Because on that night Satan saw Matt tore through heaven in his search for Gabriel and bathed everything in his path in blue flames. The angels that attempted to stop him were reduced to ashes the moment he laid eyes on them. It said that the angels were forced to seal away an entire section of heaven because it was too heavily corrupted by his demonic fire. In the last-ditch effort to save themselves, they asked Gabriel to placate him, and she did, Akino continued. She went to him, pleading for him to remember their dream of a peaceful world where they could be together. And with those words she quelled his wrath, Ria said. But by then, it was already too late. Both of them could sense him approaching. The Lord Asia whispered, her eyes widening in horror. Riaz nodded. God himself had come to strike down Satan, she said quietly. Satan-sama asked his beloved to stay away from the conflict and that when the fighting was over, he would come to find her. While the two deities clashed in the skies above, the three factions continued to wage war below them. Those that witnessed it say that their final battle could be felt across the cosmos. But in the end, only one of them walked away. Satan saw Mephil, but since then, the world has found relative peace, Akino said with a sad smile. He fulfilled his promise to Gabriel, but his own dream to marry her went unfulfilled. That's terrible, Asia cried. Despite its rather grim ending, it's still a very popular story, Ria said. I doubt there's a child in the underworld that doesn't know it. And what happened to Gabriel? Asia asked. The redhead frowned. It's assumed that she survived, she muttered. The official story is that she secluded herself from the other angels so she could mourn, but she hasn't been seen or heard from in years. Hey everyone, a voice called out. They turned to see Tamamo entering the room, and now Unbound Issei was standing behind her with a scowl on his face. Dinner's ready, she blinked and gazed at the dejected looks on their faces. Wow, what's with this super depressing atmosphere? It's nothing, Tamamo-san, Riaz chuckled. She stood along with her servants. After we eat, I want everyone in bed early. We're in for the fight of our lives tomorrow. Hi, but you, the two stepped aside as the group filed past them towards the dining room. But as the fallen angels walked through the threshold, Issei could have sworn he saw them throwing him several awkward glances. The Mamo turned to him, an eyebrow raised. What was that about? Issei shrugged. No idea, he said, clueless. So, tomorrow is the day? A red-haired man questioned as he sat atop an elaborate throne. The room was only dimly lit, casting a shadow over his form. Indeed, Mayusama, a silver-haired maid, nodded. Ria's Harem has spent the last week training at the family manor in the mountains with a boy named Gary-stu Issei and his peerage. Oh? The man asked curiously. Do you have any information about this boy, Grafia? Very little, the woman shook her head. We have a basic description. Messy brown hair and brown eyes. No outstanding qualities. But his peerage? Yes. His peerage consists of several legendary figures, Grafia said. For example, his bishop is the legendary Kitsune, Tamamo no Mei, and his knight is Mordart Pendragon, the Knight of Treachery. The red-haired man froze. He was silent for several minutes before a small smile slipped onto his face. Slowly, the smile turned into a full-blown grin as he began to laugh uproariously. Now, Sama? Grafia questioned, slightly perturbed at his sudden break of decorum. Sergiches? I am sorry, dear, the man chuckled, wiping a tear from his eye. I just wasn't expecting him of all people to be helping my Amato. Him? She repeated. Sergiches muttered, his smile turning into a frown. But even if it's him, 1 week isn't enough time for Riaz to beat Reiser. He can do amazing things, but he's no miracle worker. Mayusama, who is this person you speak so highly of? Grafia asked in a polite tone. Not telling, the man responded in a sing-song voice, causing a vein to pop up on the woman's forehead. But I will say this, the corner of his lip corked upwards. If this all goes according to my predictions, the world is in for a real shock. Sergic has turned his head to gaze out of a nearby window as his face split into another grin. Because this man is a true devil among devils. Issei was silent as he walked through the moonlit hallway. Suddenly, he sneezed. Pondering over the random phenomenon for a moment, he shrugged before continuing towards his destination. Uma had been acting strangely ever since dinner started. She would spend minutes tearing at her plate, biting her lip. Then, every once in a while, she would take a glance in his direction before quickly looking away if she accidentally caught his eye. The black-haired angel hadn't been the only one either. Carl Werner and Middlet would occasionally glance between the two of them, looks of concern on their faces. Issei wasn't sure what had happened, but he was determined to find out. He turned the corner and nearly ran straight into Riaz as she came from the opposite direction. The brunette questioned curiously. Shouldn't you be in bed, senpai? The crimson-haired girl chuckled slightly. I'm having trouble sleeping, Riaz said sheepishly before glancing at him, a thoughtful look on her face. If you're not too busy, would you mind keeping me company for a while? I wished to speak with you about something. Well, Issei muttered, I suppose it can wait. What was it you wanted to talk about? So, that's your attack plan? The brown-haired boy questioned as the two of them sat within a stone gazebo on the manor grounds. Yes, Riaz nodded, but I can tell by the look on your face that you don't entirely agree with it. There are a few points that I disagree with, Issei admitted. You're keeping the Phoenix Tears with you. Why? We're only allowed 1 vial per game, the heiress said in her defense. But you're keeping Asia with you as well, Issei countered. Keeping both with you is overkill, especially when they could be put to better use someplace else. I agree that sending Asia to the front lines would be suicide. You'd have to send someone to protect her, wasting manpower. That leaves us with the Phoenix Tears. Your best bet would be to give it to Kiba or Aquino. I see, Riaz murmured. She let out a dark chuckle. And here I was thinking my plan was perfect. I'm such a fool. Issei could sense there was another meaning behind those words. Senpai. If I had just refused the raiding game, I could have had until my college graduation to plan and prepare, the crimson-haired girl said bitterly. Razor showing up, mocking and challenging me, it was all a setup by my family. Their grandmother? The brunette questioned, recalling Ria's words that day. Lasseror stole Gremory, she explained. She's not actually my grandmother. More like very great-grandmother she was. The first Gremory, Issei said quietly, one of the original 72 devils and founder of Clan Gremory. Riaz nodded, surprised. One of the few that are still alive, she said. She's the one who made a deal with Clan Phoenix. And she's the one who's been pressuring me the most into getting married, Riaz scowled. But she's only interested in expanding her power and influence. Meanwhile, Issei's mind was going a mile a minute. Lee Sarah. He thought incredulously. But why? Abu-sama didn't always used to be this way, Ria sighed. In fact, she's the one who started the Grimmery family's tradition of treating our servants like family. But ever since my grandfather, her husband, died, she changed. She became cold and distant, thinking of nothing but power and wealth. If it were up to her, I'd be married and pregnant already. At least my father wants me to be ready before I get married, but he supports the engagement as well. The girl sighed once again. I don't want to marry Razor, she said quietly. He's just like everyone else. When he sees me, he only sees Rias of the Grimari. He wants to marry me not because he loves me or even likes me. No, he wants to marry me because it will make his clan stronger. She turned away from him and gazed up at the moon. When I get married, I want it to be with someone who loves Rias, she whispered, not Rias of the Grimari. Issei was silent for several moments. You're very brave, he said after a while, causing Rias to look up at him in surprise. To go against your entire family and fight for what you believe in. That takes a lot of courage. The brunette walked over and sat next to her. And I agree with you. Marriage should be something you share with the person you hold close to your heart. Rias chuckled. And here I thought the whole world was against me. Well, you can rest assured that I'm on your side. Issei smiled, placing a hand on her shoulder. Rias? The girl couldn't help but smile back. Thank you for your time, Issei-kun, Rias said with a small smile as they stood outside the door to her room. I was happy to help, Rias, he nodded at her. Good night. Good night, she replied before entering her room, closing the door behind her. Issei smiled and made his way to his own room. He had just placed his hand on the doorknob when he froze. Shit, I forgot to talk to Yuma, he sighed. She's probably asleep by now. I suppose it'll have to wait until tomorrow. He turned the handle and walked inside only to freeze once more at the sight before him. Welcome back, Ice-kun. Uma, Issei muttered. What, why? The black-haired girl sat on his bed, wearing only a sheer black nightgown. Beneath it, he could clearly see a lacy black bra and matching panties. What are you doing? You, the girl said suggestively as she sauntered over to him. Draping her arms over his shoulders, she leaned her head upwards, kissing him on the nape of his neck. This is rather sudden, don't you think? He murmured as her fingers began unbuttoning his shirt. You seem perfectly content this morning. Why the sudden attitude change? Is it wrong that I want to do this? She whispered huskily as she pulled him towards the bed. Do you find me so unpleasant that the thought of making love with me repulses you? Would you prefer one of your servant girls? Or Gabriel? Issei's eyes widened and he pulled away from her. Who told you about her? Rias did, Yuma said, obviously upset. Why didn't you tell me? Yuma, Issei sighed, running a hand through his hair. All that stuff with Gabriel, it was all in the past. And it's not something I like to talk about. I haven't seen or heard from her in years. Not even Michael knows where she is anymore. She still sends messages to Heaven every now and then to let them know that she's okay. But she doesn't let anyone know where she is or how to contact her. Do you still love her? She asked quietly. Issei paused. Yes. I do, he admitted. Even after all this time, I can't just forget her. I still care for her, and I think I always will. And what am I to you? She questioned, averting her eyes. Issei placed a hand under her chin and gently lifted her head to look at him. You're my Yuma-chan, he said with a small smile. Someone that I love and cherish. Rainer? Call me Rainer, she requested. I don't like the name Yuma very much. I only chose that name because I planned on killing you at sunset. As you wish, he leaned forward and kissed her gently. My lovely fallen angel Rainer, my handsome demon king, the black-haired girl whispered, placing both hands on his cheeks. Can you show me your true form? What? Issei asked, surprised. Why, it's just there's this whole other side of you that I don't know, she said quietly. And I want to know. Can you show me? Issei paused for a moment before closing his eyes. Rainer watched on in silent awe as his features began to warp before her eyes. Here it is, he said softly as he gazed down at her. The girl traced his features gently, her eyes roaming his form, memorizing every inch. You look so different, she whispered. But at the same time you're exactly the same. I told you, he chuckled. I lied to you about who I am. I never lied to you about the kind of person I am. Rainer was silent for several moments, and Issei's eyes widened in surprise when two jet-black angel wings erupted from her back. And this is who I am, she said quietly. You're beautiful, Issei murmured, gently running his hand along one of her wings. He turned his gaze towards her face and stared deeply into her eyes. Slowly, he leaned forward and kissed her once more. Eyes, she said softly as they fell onto the bed once again. He murmured, kissing her collarbone. Be gentle, I will. In her room down the hall, Ria's entire face was flushed red. She attempted to block out the sounds coming from Issei's room with her pillow to no avail. Yuma seemed determined to make as much noise as possible. "AMU, father," the redhead muttered as she heard the fallen angel let out a particularly loud moan. "Why in the world would you not get the wall soundproofed?" Ria sighed and continued to stare at the ceiling blankly. "Faster, Ice, go faster." Her eye twitched, and she let out another sigh. "Oh, well," Ria thought as one of her hands began creeping downward. "I'll have to wash my panties tomorrow. Might as well wash the sheets too." "Nausema?" Graphia asked incredulously. "Why are you crying?" "I don't know, Graphia," Sertzik sobbed as he began hugging a Ria's plushie he had pulled out of nowhere. "I don't know." Chapter 17. Issei was silent as he and the others sat waiting in the occult research clubroom. He watched Rias take a sip of her tea. Although the crimson-haired princess exuded a relaxed demeanor, Issei could still read the small signs in her posture that made her nervousness apparent. The day was the day that the raiding game was to take place. Ria's servants had taken to milling about the room. Some, naturally, appeared more nervous than others. While Lakino was drinking tea in an attempt to soothe her nerves, Kaneko was adjusting the straps of her fighting gloves every few minutes. Meanwhile, Kiba was polishing his sword, twitching every so often in anticipation. All of them save Asia and Chio were wearing their school uniforms. The blonde girl had instead chosen to wear her old nun habit, while the brunette had simply worn her casual clothing. And it was these two who were the most agitated. Asia was currently curled up in a chair, muttering small prayers to herself and flinching from the burning headache she received for her trouble. Meanwhile, Chiho was fidgeting about in her seat and glancing about the room worriedly. It was only when the brown-haired girl began to breathe erratically that Issei finally decided to speak up. "All of you. Relax," he said firmly. "We've only been training a week," Asia murmured. "These people have been participating in and winning writing games for years. How are we supposed to beat someone who's immortal?" Chiho asked helplessly. "If that's your mentality going into battle, then you've already lost," Ashaya said sternly. "There is always a path to victory. This battle is no different. While the Phoenix clan possesses near-instant regeneration, it is not without its limits," Issei nodded. "There are two ways of defeating them. Rias. The first would be to outlast him," the crimson-haired princess said quietly. "While he heals near instantaneously, his stamina is not limitless. If we can force him to regenerate enough times, he'll end up exhausting himself. That strategy is only viable if most of you survive until the very end," Issei explained. "With a barrage of attacks from multiple directions, you will be able to wear him down. The second method would be to break his spirit," Ashia said. "If he doesn't have the will to keep fighting, he will be unable to regenerate. He will most likely surrender in this scenario." "How are we supposed to break his spirit?" Asia asked quietly. "That I do not know," Issei admitted. "You would have to ask Rias. She knows him far better than I." The Redid was silent as they all turned to her. After several moments, she spoke up. "Grazer is a cold and arrogant man," Rias said softly. "The only way to break his spirit would be to utterly crush him in battle. So we really only have one way to beat him," Kiba muttered. "We have to defeat his entire peerage. Survive until the very end and defeat Reiser himself." It seemed that the conversation had only caused the feelings of hopelessness in the room to amplify. "You have one element in your favor," Suzuki spoke up, drawing everyone's attention to her. The element of surprise. Razor is, as you said, an arrogant man. He will underestimate you. You must use that to your advantage. You will have to defeat his forces swiftly and decisively before they have a chance to respond. Just then, the door to the clubroom opened and two figures stepped inside. Sono Kaicho? Tsubaki Fuko Kaike? Chiho questioned. What are you two doing here? There's going to be a live broadcast so that our families can watch, Rias explained to her. Sona and Tsubaki are responsible for broadcasting it. That and it's Rias' first rating game, Sona said in an even tone. I wouldn't miss this for anything. Scouting your future competition? The redhead questioned, smirking at her. The corners of Sona's lip quirked upward, but she didn't reply. Suddenly, a magic circle appeared on the floor, shattering the jovial atmosphere that Sona's arrival had brought. Slowly, a figure emerged from the light. Issei's eyes widened, his jaw nearly dropping in shock. Ashia appeared similarly stunned. It was a young woman in her early 20s with silver-colored hair and matching eyes. Her long hair flowed all the way down to her waist with two braids framing either side of her face. She wore a blue and white French-made outfit with long sleeves and a white headband. Lucinda. Issei muttered in shock. The woman was taken aback by his reaction. Her surprised expression lasted only a moment before her eyes narrowed at him. Lucinda? Rias asked in confusion. Who is that? This is Grafia, my brother's wife and queen. I see, the brunette murmured. He shook his head as though to clear his head of unbidden thoughts. I apologize. I mistook you for someone else. The crimson-haired girl looked like she wished to inquire further, but shook her head and turned towards Grafia once again. It's time, then. The silver-haired maid broke her stare on his face and turned to address Rias. Yes, in a few moments, we will use this magic circle to transport you and your peerage to the battlefield. Anakiho began, raising her hand. Where exactly is the battlefield? It will take place in a neutral alternate space, specifically created for this raiding game, Aquino told her. Because it's not real, we are allowed to cause as much collateral damage as necessary. We could even burn it to the ground if we wanted to. That's scary. Chiho flinched as the black-haired girl smiled with a dark gleam in her eye. We will be broadcasting the game from the student council room, Sona said. We'll be cheering you on from there as well. Good luck, Rias. Thank you, Sona. The crimson-haired girl nodded. Believe in yourselves, Issei said to them, as he and his servants stood to follow them. Trust and support one another. Cover each other's weaknesses. And above all else, never lose hope. We won't, Rias said firmly. We'll see you after the game, Issei-kun. Each of his servants gave their own parting advice to their respective pupils before following him, and Sona out the door. Tell me, Issei-san, the glasses-wearing girl asked quietly as they began their trek towards the student council room. Do you believe that Trias can beat Reiser? Oh, Issei questioned, a small smirk on her face. Is that doubt I hear in your voice, Sona-senpai? He chuckled as her face flushed momentarily. They've come far in the week they've had. We'll have to just wait and see. I see, Sona said softly as they entered the student council room. Thank you for helping her. She's going to need all the help she can get. We're going to set up the broadcast now, Tsubaki told them. You may sit wherever you like. They did so. The student council room was much larger than the occult research room, giving them plenty of room to spread out and find a good spot to watch the television where the match would be shown. Issei looked up at the screen. Rias and her servants were shown still sitting in the clubroom. It seemed that the game would be taking place in an exact replica of the academy. They found the fallen angels gathered around the La Vesiad near the window. I hope they haven't been giving you too much trouble, the brown-haired boy remarked as he sat down next to his girlfriend. Zona's made sure everyone knows we're in your custody, Kallerner explained. Nobody wanted to challenge her authority here at the academy, so we should be fine. Middlet, meanwhile, raised an eyebrow. The game's taking place here? She questioned. Wouldn't that give Rias a tactical advantage? It was Razor-sama's suggestion, a voice explained to them. The group turned to see Grafia entering the room, staring at them with a stoic expression on her face. He said, and I quote, I wish for her to feel at home when I utterly crush her. Unquote. What a prick, Middle muttered. Grafia turned her gaze towards Issei. You are Heidi Issei, correct? Indeed. He nodded. And you are Grafia Lucifuge, the silver-haired queen of annihilation? But I am, the silver-haired woman said, her eyes narrowed. Now tell me, how is it that you know my elder sister? I don't know what you're talking about, Issei shrugged. Do not play games with me, Grafia said sharply. How is it you know the nameless and the Lucifuge? She was banished from our clan centuries before I was born. She was erased from history, my family made sure of that. How is it you know that name? I must ask you to refrain from speaking to our master that way, Tamamo said coolly. Bravely glanced at the girl, her fox ears in particular, before looking back at his Issei. Who are you? She questioned, her voice considerably calmer. To have gathered legends into your service. You have fallen angels serving under you. Even Mausama speaks highly of you. I can only wonder why is that. Let's just say that Sergiches and I have quite a history together, Issei said dismissively. Now, don't you have a rating game to referee? It looks like they've already finished discussing their battle strategy. They're waiting for you to announce the start of the match. Grafia glanced up at the screen to see Arius, Reiser, and their respective peerages waiting impatiently for the game to start. She looked back at Issei with an expression that clearly said, "This isn't over." The silver-haired woman walked over to a nearby intercom and began to speaking into it. Meanwhile, Tamamo turned to Issei, a single eyebrow raised. Lucinda Lucifuge? She questioned. Who is she? Mordred demanded. Issei ignored them, instead sharing a concerned look with Issei. Issei-sama, he began. Do you think she? The brunette boy shook his head. We'll talk about it later, he said, his mouth set into a thin line. His servants gave him one last look before turning back to the television screen. I apologize for the delay. Grafia's voice spoke over intercom. This is an unofficial rating game between Razor Phoenix and Rias Gremory. Looks like they're finally ready to start, Rias muttered. I wonder what took so long. As you can see, the battlefield for this game will be an exact replica of Core Academy, a private school in Japan. Rias Gremory will be based at the Occult Research Clubroom in the old school building. Razor Phoenix will be based at the principal's office in the new school building. The game will end when a king is either defeated or surrenders. Devils, prepare yourselves. The rating game starts now. This is it, Ria said, standing up. She looked at each and every one of her servants. Issei-kun and his allies spent an entire week making us stronger. We're not going to disappoint them. Hi, but you? You all know the plan, now let's go and win. Interesting, Ishii murmured as they watched several of Razor's PAWNs rapidly approaching awaiting Kiba, Kaneko, and Akino. She intends to lure them into a trap. The logical plan, Issei said. Normally, someone with as few servants as Rias would be unwilling to risk so many pieces this early on in the game. Razor will not be expecting such a strong opposition. Let's just hope that they can keep this up. Razor Phoenix's 3 pawns have retired. Grafia's boy said coolly over the intercom. Excellent, Rias nodded. She turned towards Chiho and nodded. You're up next, Chiho. Kaneko will meet you in the gym. Okay, the brunette girl said quietly. Rias watched her slowly stand up, her legs noticeably shaking. Rias frowned at her. Chiho, the redid said firmly, causing the younger girl to flinch. The Gremory heiress stood from her desk and strutted over to her. Chiho flinched once again as Rias raised her arms and pulled her into a hug. Everything will be fine, Rias said softly. Believe in yourself. She raised one of her hands and waved it over Chiho's head while murmuring something indiscernible. The shorter girl gasped as she felt a surge of power coursing throughout her body. What? You feel it, right? The redhead asked with a small smile. When you first activated your sacred gear, I had to seal away a great portion of your power because your body was unable to endure that much stress. That spell was me unsealing a portion of it. See, this is amazing, Chiho whispered, invigorated by this new strength. Now go, Rias commanded. Why, yes, but you, the brown-haired girl stuttered before finally being released. She bowed once and made her exit. Looks like they've finished protecting their flank, Tamamo noted as Kaneko, Cuba and Aquino split up in different directions. It seems our lecture on the first day struck a chord with her, Issei smiled. Rias wants no surprises. That includes PAWNS sneaking into their base and promoting to QUEN. It looks like the white-haired brat and the top-heavy shrimp are headed towards the gym now, Mordred said. Indeed, Akia nodded. The gymnasium stands at the center of the school. Whomever controls it will have a significant tactical advantage over the battlefield. But can they gain control over it? Oh, I think we're in for a real shock, Issei smiled mischievously. It's pretty dark in here, Chiho murmured as she entered the gym behind Kaneko. Scared? The white-haired girl asked. Chiho shook her head. No. I'm just having flashbacks to that time with that exorcist, she whispered. It's okay, Kaneko said quietly. I'll protect you. Hey, now, the brunette quipped. It's my job to protect you. Anakamata glanced back at her, a single eyebrow raised. You're weak, she said bluntly. Taiho fell over. I know, she muttered as she picked herself back up. But you're my kohai. And as your senpai, it's my job to help and protect you in any way I can. I see. The corner of Kaneko's mouth quirked upwards slightly. Then I'm in your care, senpai. Yash. Chiho grinned. Boy. Grimy servants, a voice called out to them. You're being awfully noisy. In the time you spent chatting, we could have killed you 5 different ways. Why don't you come out and face us? The gymnasium light suddenly sparked to life, illuminating the entire room. Chiho and Kaneko glanced up to see 4 enemy servants staring at them from across the room, all of them female. The tallest girl, wearing a Chinese kippeo, hummed. Looks like we've caught 2 shrimp. What a shame. I was hoping to fight the lightning Miko or that blonde cutie, she smirked at them. Well, nice to meet you. My name is Shulan, Razor-sama's ROOK. The girl with blue hair and pigtails nodded at them. Mira, I'm APAWN. We're Isla and Nell. 2 green-haired twins said cheerfully. We're PAWNS, too. Rukaniko murmured. Her power is very high. I think she could fight on par with the QUEN. Seriously? Chiho squeaked. We really are at a disadvantage, aren't we? Taiho-senpai, the white-haired girl said as she began tightening her gloves. Do you think you can keep those PAWNS busy while I take on that ROOK? Alright, Chiho nodded as boosted gear appeared on her left arm. Boost. Let's go. Stay on your toes, you two, a girl with long black hair called towards her 2 companions as they walked through the small copse of trees towards the occult research clubroom. Those brats managed to take out Marian, Burand, and Shiraya. Don't let your guard down. Oh, come on, Cyrus, one of the girls behind her giggled. She had blue hair and sported a pair of cat ears. Do you honestly believe they pose that big of a threat to us, Naya? Naya? Another girl with red hair and ears cackled. I'd like to see them try. Cyrus was about to retort when a familiar sound reached her ears. Magic circle! She roared. From behind the trees, a myriad of magic circles had activated, sending bolts of electricity towards them. Get out of the way. Naya, one of the girls cried as she was struck. Naya! Her twin shouted, reaching a hand towards her. No, you idiot! Sarah screamed from where she had left to avoid the lightning strikes, but it was too late. Both girls had left themselves wide open for an attack. A mere moment later, they were both impaled by a sword. Sorry about that, Kiba smiled. But you've gotta do what you've gotta do. Razor Phoenix's 2 PAWNS have retired. Really? Sarah scowled. How in the hell did those 2 make it into Razor-sama's peerage? It goes to show that quantity isn't always better than quality, Kiba chuckled. Era, a sensual voice called out. You can handle this yourself, right, Kiba-kun? Indeed, the blonde boy smiled. I look forward to seeing how far I've come. Cyrus grinned as she drew her sway hand her. Don't get cocky, Brad. I wouldn't dream of it. Razor Phoenix's 2 PAWNS have retired. Are you kidding me? Shulin growled as she kicked Kaneko in the chest, sending the smaller girl skidding away. Niantly lost. Looks like Razor Phoenix's peerage isn't all that it's cracked up to be, the white-haired girl said monotonously as she dusted herself off. The Chinese girl scoffed. Please, those two were only recent additions, and the 3 PAWNS before an ad? Kaneko asked, raising an eyebrow. Shulin twitched. Oh, shut up, she growled as the two clashed once more. Across the room, Chiho was busy handling the opposing PAWNS. Iya. Stop running, one of the green-haired twins shouted as they chased after the brunette girl with chainsaws. Yeah, we just want to cut you up a little, her sister agreed. You people are insane, Chiho screamed as she ducked beneath a slash from one of the twins. Stay away from me. Don't be such a pussy, one of them shouted. Mira, stop her. Taiho barely had time to react as the blue-haired girl suddenly appeared in front of her with a BM staff in her hands. Crap. Just as Mira thrust her staff at her, Chiho leapt high into the air, far higher than any normal human would have been capable of. No way, Mira muttered in shock. Razor-sama said that she became a devil less than a month ago. That shouldn't be possible. Chiho herself was similarly shocked. I guess that hellish training with Suzuki-senpai really paid off. As she landed, she immediately glanced behind her to see her opponents lining up before her. Shit, we've got to end this now, one of the twins exclaimed, or Razor-sama will be mega pissed. As one, the 3 PAWNS raised their weapons and engulfed them in magical flames. Chiho's eyes dilated in fear. Oh. Meanwhile, Kaneko grunted as she barely ducked beneath one of Shulin's kicks. She's fast. They're pretty good, the Chinese girl complimented her. But I'm afraid that the games end here. In an instant, the taller girl crouched down and swept the white-haired girl's feet from under her. Kaneko's eyes widened. This move, it was the same move Morgiana had pulled on her back during their training. But this time, she was prepared. Leaning backwards, she allowed the momentum to carry her farther than her opponent had intended. She then threw both hands in front of her, and used that same momentum to flip away from the taller girl. Wow, you are pretty good, Shulin remarked. What's your name? Oda Kaneko, the white-haired girl replied evenly. You're pretty good yourself. She lowered herself into a stance. But fortunately for me, you're not as good as Margiana-senpai. Shulin didn't reply. She instead charged at the younger girl, leaped into the air and launched a flying kick. Kaneko saw this coming, however, and caught the older girl, tossing her across the room. And you're not nearly as fast either, Kaneko finished. The Chinese girl chuckled as she regained her balance. You're not exactly a speeding train either, shrimp. Kaneko's eyes narrowed. We'll see about that, she muttered, allowing her eyes to flutter shut. Boy, what the hell are you doing? Shulin's indignant voice was ignored as the Nikomata began focusing. Feel the flow of energy, allow it to pool around me. You should never take your eyes off your opponent, shrimp. Then, release it all at once. It happened so quickly. Shulin didn't even see her move. Her only warning was a sound akin to a sonic boom before her stomach erupted in pain. One moment, the white-haired girl was standing across the room, then the next, she was burying her fist into the taller girl's abdomen. Blood spouted from the Chinese girl's mouth as she was sent hurtling across the room and clear through the wall of the gymnasium. And Echo's eyes widened upon seeing this. Crap, she exclaimed. We were supposed to keep them inside. However, as she made to go retrieve the taller girl, she suddenly collapsed. Kaneko let out a shriek of pain as she felt the muscles in her legs being torn to shreds. What the hell happened? Middle tasked in shock as they watched Kaneko writhing in agony on the television screen. That idiot, Tamama whispered. Her hand was covering her mouth as she watched with horrified eyes. I told her she wasn't ready to try prana burst yet. Her muscles aren't used to being saturated with that much chakra. You had an entire week? Mordred growled. Did you spend it twiddling your thumbs or something? The kitsune glared at her murderously. She wasn't comfortable enough to start practicing until 2 days before the game, Tamamo snapped. I know you're unfamiliar with this concept, but there's something called consideration towards others. Enough, is she? You're broken. What's done is done. Getting angry won't solve anything. Issei placed a hand on Tamamo's shoulder and began rubbing circles with his thumb in an attempt to calm her. I know you're worried about her, he said softly. But just wait for the time being. We'll go and see her after the match ends. The fox girl sighed but leaned into his touch nonetheless. Yes, master, Paniko-chan. Chiho shouted as she saw the younger girl collapse. Keep your eyes on your opponent, Mira exclaimed, as she swung at the brunette with her flaming staff. Damn it, Chiho thought furiously. I need to take these three out. But how? Suddenly, a thought came to her. But can I do it? Can you do what? One of the twins asked, revving her chainsaw. Live up. Because that would be the best option at this point. The other twin mocked. Taiho ignored their insults and instead began focusing her energy. Just imagine energy being pulled from my core. Then imagine what I want to happen, she murmured. Concentrate, concentrate. Crap, I think she's gonna use magic, one of the twins shouted. We've got to take her out now. The other agreed. As one, all three PAWNS began charging at her, their weapons raised high. Concentrate, Chiho whispered, as the image of the powerful wind slamming the three girls into the wall surfaced in her mind. Now she lashed her arms forward. In an instant, a powerful gust came forth, shredding the three girls' clothing, leaving them stark naked in the middle of the school gym. Hiya! Taiko watched numbly as the enemy PAWNS shrieked in unison. They each fell into a squatting position in an attempt to cover themselves up. This is what you wanted, Mira demanded. Are you a Letzi? One of the twins shrieked. Don't they call it Yuri here? The other questioned. And no. Chiho shouted, waving her arms frantically. I'm not like that. I'm not into breasts. So you're a pedalezi? The first twin was in hysterics at this point. That's even worse. Stay away from us. They shouted in unison. And no, Chiho cried, looking to be on the verge of tears. She glanced to the side and saw Kaneko glaring at her even through her pain. The white-haired girl covered her chest with her arms. Bairi-senpai, the white-haired girl muttered. Chiho twitched, but moved to help her fallen teammate regardless. Kaneko-chan, are you okay? Chiho exclaimed as she lifted the smaller girl's upper body into her arms, being sure to cradle her head carefully. What happened? Aniko Mata sighed. I was an idiot, she said softly. Tamamo-ne warned me, but I did it anyway. She shook her head. You have to go after Shulin. I accidentally punched her through the wall. I'm not leaving you here, the brunette said firmly. Oh, Kaneko snapped. I'm just dead weight like this. Our goal is to beat Razor Phoenix. That's all that matters. We need to stick to the plan. No, Chiho shouted in return, causing the white-haired girl to flinch and look up at her in surprise. I'm not leaving you behind. Piniko stared at her. Why? She asked after a while. Chiho was silent for several moments before sighing. It has something to do with my training. The brown-haired girl collapsed to her hands and knees, covered in dirt, and gasping for breath. A stoic Suzuki stood before her, not a speck of dust on the black-haired girl's clothes. Why am I doing this again? Chiho coughed as she resisted the urge to pass out right then and there. To make you stronger, Suzuki said coolly. As you are now, even a fresh genin straight out of the academy could destroy you in a fight. Well, sorry for not being some super ninja, the brunette muttered bitterly. The raven-haired girl scoffed, crossing her arms. You think I was any different than you are when I first started? I'll be honest with you. I was probably even worse off than you are right now. But I changed that with hard work and determination. Taiko looked up at her strangely. Why? She asked, after a while. Why? Suzuki repeated, raising an eyebrow. Slowly, a small, almost imperceptible smile made its way to her face. So that I could protect someone important to me? The younger girl questioned with a shocked expression on her face. Why so surprised? The kunoichi asked with a bemused smirk. Well, I just never pictured ninjas to be like that, Chiho said honestly. I've always thought of them as cold-hearted killers. And well, I don't exactly seem like the warm and fuzzy type. Suzuki finished her statement, a full-blown smirk on her face now. You'd think that about shinobi these days, wouldn't you? But even among assassins, there is a certain sense of honor, especially in my village. Your village? Suzuki was silent. She seemed to be reminiscing, on a different place at different time. Finally, after several moments of silence, Suzuki turned to face her. The normally aloof girl's face had become serious, stern, almost. Listen, brat, she said. In my village, there was a single principle held above all else. The Hokage, the leader of my village, made sure to drill it into all of our heads early on in our training. The black-haired girl stooped down to look her in the eye. So, if there's one thing I want you to learn from me, it's this, she said. Those who break the rules are trash, but those who abandon their comrades are worse than trash. Suzuki, Chiho. A voice called out to them. It's time for dinner. Let's go. Never forget that. The black-haired girl stood and began walking away, leaving a stunned Chiho staring after her. Those who break the rules are trash, Chiho repeated firmly as she hefted Kaneko onto her back. But those who abandon their comrades are worse than trash. Kaneko sighed, but a small smile made its way onto her face. Fine, she said as Chiho began half carrying, half dragging her out of the gym. When the two of them were far enough away from the building, they looked up to see a Keno flying high and above it. An enormous magic circle appeared below her, causing a massive bolt of lightning to strike the building. The result was a massive explosion that could be seen for miles. Razor Phoenix's 3 PAWNS have retired. We need to get you back to Asia, Chiho smiled. Then we can, senpai. Kaneko suddenly shouted, her eyes widening. Watch out, She was cut off as the tiny girl used her immense upper body strength to hurl her across the schoolyard. Just as Chiho hit the ground, she heard and felt a large explosion several yards away from her, right where Kaneko had been moments earlier. Kaneko-chan. Chiho cried out in shock. She rushed towards the newly formed crater and saw the white-haired girl lying motionless amid the rubble. Chiho slid down the small slope and gently lifted the tiny girl in her arms. Taiho-senpai, Kaneko murmured, a small smile making its way to her face. You're a good senpai and a good friend. Kaneko-chan, Chiho whispered, tears welling up in her eyes. When? The white-haired girl said simply, as her body began to disperse into particles of light. Rias Gremris 1 ROK has retired. Fufu, a voice chuckled from above her. Queen takes rook. Taiho numbly tilted her head upward to see a beautiful violet-haired woman floating above her, a staff in her hands. Queen takes pawn, she said, pointing her staff directly at Taiho. It seemed that she had frozen up as simply continued to stare up at her numbly. Goodbye, PAWN of the Gremry. Unfortunately for her, whatever spell she was planning to cast was cut off since a bolt of lightning aimed at her chest forced her to dodge. Era, Akeno muttered as she floated down and glanced at Chiho worriedly. Are you alright, Kai-chan? Akeno-senpai, Chiho whispered, her body beginning to shake uncontrollably. Chiho. Ria's voice reverberated through her mind. Now's not the time to be freezing up. But you, the brunette said, still trembling. Kaneko-chan. Whenever a piece retires from the game, they're transported to the medical ward, Ria said calmly. Kaneko will be fine. You need to focus. Just leave this to me, Chiho-chan. Akeno smiled at her reassuringly. Razor Phoenix's 1K and IGHT has retired. It seems the Kiba-kun has finished up on his end. He'll be meeting up with you farther ahead. The black-haired girl winked at her. Better get going. Taiho nodded silently and shakily began running towards the inner courtyard. Okino watched her go for a moment before returning her attention to her new opponent. Ifufu, the violet-haired woman chuckled as fire began dancing within the palm of her hand. I've wanted to fight you for a long time, Lightning Miko. Era, Akano giggled as electricity began crackling around her body. I'm honored you feel that way, you ballooned, the bomb queen. Razor has lost 9 servants, Ashia murmured. 1K and IGHT and all of his PAWNS. Whereas Riaz has lost 1 ROOK. That means she's winning, right? Middle questioned. If they had started with an even amount of servants, yes, Calawarner said. But Razor has so many servants, he can afford to sacrifice them, whereas even one loss for Riaz can be devastating. I hope Kaneko is okay, Yuma piped in worriedly. Issei glanced at the door. Tamamo had left the moment Kaneko retired from the game. Morgiana had followed her at a Marcy-date pace. Ojusan is being attended to by the best healers from the Gremory and Phoenix clans, Grafia told them from where she was sitting at the intercom. And besides, the fox is with her, Mordred said off-handedly. She's the best healer there is. Oh, this is odd, Issei couldn't resist teasing her. You're complimenting to Mama, Mordred. Has anyone seen any Arila-inclined pigs recently? Suzuki questioned. It was unseasonably cool the last time we visited the underworld, as she equipped. Mordred's face flushed as everyone turned on her. Well, it's not like I hate her, the blonde knight said defensively, before pausing. Well, maybe just a little bit, she admitted. But it's a friendly kind of hate, you know? That made no sense whatsoever, middle deadpanned. Assy chuckled slightly as the small group continued their relentless teasing. He glanced up at the screen to see Chiho meeting up with Kiba. Kiba-san, Chiho muttered as two met in the inner courtyard. They slowed down to a brisk walk. Kaneko-chan, I know, Kiba said with a grimace. I heard the announcement. This will really mess up Butch's plan. But I know we can pull through. But you will come up with something. It won't matter what she comes up with, a voice called out to them. They turned to see a brown-haired girl wearing an assortment of armor approaching them. For we will defeat you here. I am the knight that serves Razor-sama. I am Carlo-man. Fiba smiled and drew his sword. I am the knight of the Gremory Kibuto. Harleman returned his smile. I am glad you have the courage to face me head-on, Kibuto. Her smile turned into a frown. However, you have been injured, correct? Kiba-san? Chiho asked in surprise. The blonde boy merely smiled once again. That other Phoenix Knight was a real handful, he said. She managed to get in a few good shots on my legs before I defeated her. I see, Carloman sighed. It would be a shame to fight a crippled opponent. Oh, don't hold back for my sake, Kiba's smile turned fierce. I may just surprise you, Carloman laughed as she drew her own sword. I like you, Kibuto. Let us cross blades as proper Knights. And with that the two charged at each other, clashing in the center of the courtyard. Taiko watched this in slight exasperation. How annoying, right? A voice called out, nearly causing the brunette to squeak in surprise. That Carlo-man is a real battle maniac. It's really uncool. The brown-haired girl turned to see an older brunette woman standing next to her, a deadpan expression on her face. Or at least, what was visible of her face since she wore a wide opera mask on the right side of it. You're not one of those Phantom of the Opera fangirls, are you? Chiho asked warily. The older woman growled. No, she snapped. Why does everyone ask me that? It's because of that ridiculous mask you wear, Isabella, another voice called out to them. Chiho's eyes widened, and she glanced to her left to see a blonde girl with drill-like hair approaching her. Right, Meiji? Indeed, Ojusama, yet another voice called out. Chiho slowly turned, a sense of dread forming in the pit of her stomach as she saw a black-haired girl in a kimono step out from behind a nearby pillar. There's nothing wrong with my mask. The first girl growled. Taiho, meanwhile, let out a small gulp. She had been surrounded by 3 of Razor's servants. If she recalled correctly the current standings correctly, they had to be his 2 bish zeros and 1 rook. The brunette girl vaguely registered the sound of someone grunting as Kiba was forced to leap back and landed next to her. It seems we're outnumbered, the blonde boy murmured as he gingerly felt his injured leg. And outclassed, Chiho whispered in return. A flash of movement in the corner of her eye caught her attention, and she turned to see Akino and Yubelina still clashing in the sky. But maybe I can even the odds. You have something in mind? Kiba questioned. The girl nodded. I'm going to help Akino-senpai, Chiho said. Kiba looked at her in surprise. I don't think these girls are going to just let you go to her aid, Chiho-san, the Knight said. That's where you come in, she replied, staring a hole into the back of Yubelina's head. Can you keep them busy for me? For a short time, yes, the blonde muttered. No more than 5 minutes. Taiho grinned. That's plenty of time. Arg! Okino cried out in pain as she felt another explosion penetrate her shield. She quickly flapped her wings and flew backwards in an attempt to avoid the brunt of the damage. Once the majority of the blast had been avoided, the black-haired girl took a moment to glare up at her opponent, as she used one of her arms to keep her tattered clothing from falling off. Ifufu, Eubelina chuckled wearily as she gazed down at the younger girl. Her own clothing was in just as bad shape as Akino's. Both girls had an assortment of scratches and burns, marring their once flawless skin. I wasn't expecting you to pose this much of a challenge, Miko, the violet-haired woman stated, giving the young priestess an appraising look. You would make a fine addition to Razor-sama's peerage. I'd rather stab myself with a holy sword than serve that pig, Akino replied disdainfully. That can certainly be arranged, Eubelina smirked. Word has it you're quite the masochist. Razor-sama has been searching for one to add to his harem. Let me restate that, the black-haired girl muttered, cold fury building up in her voice. Razor Phoenix will never come within 10 feet of me. And after we defeat him, I'll personally ensure that he is never within the same dimension as but you. You talk big, the older woman said, watching carefully as Akino's breathing became more labored the longer their battle dragged on. But you don't seem to be in any shape to back those words up. Akino scoffed. You're hardly one to talk. Oh, but aren't I? Eubelina smirk turned ice cold before she reached into the gap between her breasts and pulled out a small vial. Akino's eyes widened upon catching sight of it. You know what this is, don't you? Phoenix tears, the girl whispered. I'm sorry, Miko, the woman said, a smirk still plastered onto her face. But the games end now, arg. Eubelina cut herself off with a shriek of agony as something embedded itself into her hand, forcing her to drop the vial. No! She shrieked as she reached for the falling container, only for another hand to deftly snatch it out of her grasp. Era, Akino purred, as she fingered the vial stopper, a sadistic grin on her face. You should take better care of your possessions, Bomb Queen. Why you, but how? Eubelina finally looked to see what had forced her to drop the vial. It was an arrow, penetrating through her hand completely and emerging on the other side. It seems that you've forgotten, Akino giggled as she uncorked the vial of Phoenix tears and downed the liquid inside with a single gulp. She turned her gaze to the courtyard below and smiled warmly. That this battle is a team effort. The Bellona followed her gaze to see Sasaki Chiho, glaring at her furiously. A Japanese bow was in her hand, the strings still vibrating from her first shot. That girl! The woman shouted incredulously. She's an archer. She immediately attempted to fly out of range, only to find herself stuck in an ironclad grip. Akano smiled a deceptively sweet smile. Did you think I was going to let you escape? Down in the courtyard, Chiho was preparing for another shot. That one was for hurting Akino-senpai, the girl murmured as she reached back and drew an arrow from her quiver. Suddenly, her left hand, which was still clasped around her bow, began to glow with a bright green light as boosted gear materialized on her arm. Remember the steps of kicking, Chiho whispered to herself. Yagami, the readying of the bow. Boost. Mikayakashi, the raising of the bow. Boost. Boost. I could whip drawing of the arrow. Boost. 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 Shit. Isabel roared as she charged at the girl. We've got to stop her. I don't think so. Kiba intercepted her fist with the flat of his blade. Now, Carlo man? The brunette shouted, prompting the brown-haired swordswoman to begin her own assault. However, Kiba foresaw this and immediately removed the pressure from Isabella's fist, surprising her and causing the brunette to lurch forward. The blonde boy then raised his leg and kicked her in the stomach, forcing her away before pivoting on his heel and intercepting Carloman's blade with his own, all within a split second of time. What? The brown-haired swordswoman uttered in shock. How could you move that fast with your injuries? I just spent the better part of the week getting the utter shit beaten out of me by some of the greatest swordsmen in history, Kiba remarked with a dangerous smile on his face. These injuries are nothing. He forced her blade away and resumed his guard on Chiho, his gaze growing fierce. Come and try me. He snarled. Hi, Chiho whispered, drawing the arrow across the bow to its fullest extent. Boost. This can't seriously be happening. The drill-haired girl muttered as she stared at Chiho incredulously. Boost. No. Eubelina shrieked as she began to violently struggle against Akino, but the black-haired girl's grip remained steadfast. No. Boost. Taiho glared up at the violet-haired woman, her body trembling uncontrollably from the sheer amount of power being contained within her small frame. This one is for Kaneko, you bitch. She snarled. Transfer. Nah. The violet-haired woman shrieked as Chiho let the arrow fly. With a booming roar, the small projectile suddenly became a whirlwind of red energy as it hurtled at terrifying speed towards the woman. Bokendo barely had enough time to escape being caught up in the blast. All she heard was the purple-haired woman shriek in utter agony. Both sides could only look on in awe as Yubelina was engulfed in a flurry of draconic energies. Finally, when the light died down, they watched in stunned silence as the violet-haired woman's defeated form fell to the ground in an undignified heap. Akino smiled, floating down to the broken body of Yubelina, who stared at her through bleary eyes. I'm impressed you managed to survive that bomb, Queen. I thought you would have died for sure. I can't believe that, the older woman muttered as her body began to disperse into particles of light. Pawn takes Queen. Just who was that? That was Sasaki Chiho, second-year high school student, Akino giggled. And the current Sekiryuta? The Red Dragon Emperor? Yubelina coughed. You had someone like that all along? Indeed, Okino smiled. You could say she was our secret weapon, the woman muttered. Her body had almost completely faded away now. It matters not, you cannot defeat Razor-sama. But Kendo's eyes narrowed at her. We'll see about that, Bomb Queen. Razor Phoenix's Quen has retired. We'll see about that. Back in the student council room, the spectators were in a frenzy of excitement. Who knew the brat had it in her? Mordred let out a loud laugh. She never mentioned that she practiced kicking, Kellerner stated, amazement in her voice. Oh yes, Issei said, a triumphant smile on his face. She's actually quite talented. Unfortunately, several years of being unable to win the national kicking championships have left her insecure about her own talents. Oh, indeed, the brunette nodded. She's come in second place 3 years in a row. Apparently, she keeps getting beaten by someone from Fioki City. The name escapes me. Truly? Ashiya murmured. That person must be a prodigy of sorts. Chiho-kun's form is impeccable. Maybe, Margaret grunted, leaning back in her seat. But it looks like all that boosting really took it out of her. Indeed. On the screen, Chiho appeared to be barely able to keep herself from collapsing from sheer exhaustion. Miss M muttered quietly, this could pose a problem. Asia perked up upon hearing the latest announcement over the intercom. They defeated the enemy Kyui, and she asked in surprise. But of course, Ria smiled, a triumphant look in her eyes. With the Sekiroite on our side, victory is practically assured. The crimson-haired girl stood, causing the younger blonde to turn to her in surprise. Be but you? Riaz turned to her, a new gleam in her eyes. Let's go, Asia, she commanded. We strike while the iron is hot. It's time we show Razor his place. Hey, are you sure, but you? Asia questioned uneasily. Razor still has some of his most powerful pieces on the field. Then they will fall, the redhead said, her voice absolute. Now let's go. Yes, but you. Taiko took a deep gasping breath as she slowly sank to her knees. Her body still shook from the strain of accumulating so much power within such a short amount of time. Quickly take her out, the blonde girl shouted. Now! Surprisingly, Carloman was quick to obey her. Hi, Oju-sama. The female quickly charged at the incapacitated girl, only to be intercepted once again by Kiba. The blonde boy grunted as his injured leg was jostled from the clash but held firm regardless. Out of the corner of his eye, he could see Isabella flanking him to reach Chio. From across the courtyard, he saw Meiji murmuring under her breath, water magic beginning to gather and flow around her. Not good, Kiba thought frantically to himself. However, the Phoenix Bishop was forced to abandon her spell and erect a barrier around herself as a bolt of lightning suddenly came crashing down from above. Without Mihi to worry about, Kiba was left free to maneuver himself to intercept the oncoming Rook. A familiar, sensual voice giggled from high above them. It seems you girls have been bullying 2 of my cute little kohai. Phoebus shoved the enemy servants away and glanced up to see Akino descending towards them. Glad to see you unharmed, Akino-senpai. Ifufu, the black-haired girl giggled and winked at the brunettes still catching her breath beside them. It's all thanks to Kai-chan here. Who knew she had that in her? Certainly not I, the blonde smiled. You were fantastic, Chiho-san. Thanks, the brown-haired girl muttered. Now, if you'll excuse me, I think I'll just take a nap now. However, Akino suddenly froze, a frown taking shape on her lovely face. I'm afraid you'll have to wait for that nap, Kai-chan, she said, as Ria spoke to her through her magic earpiece. Chiho questioned, glancing up at her tiredly. It seems that Bachu is making her move, the ponytailed queen said quietly. And she's asked that you join her. Then me? The brunette gasped. But why me? She believes that you've earned the right to be at her side when she defeats Razor. Okino winked at her. You put on quite the performance today. You've exceeded all of our expectations. But I can't just leave you two alone out here. There's no need to worry about us, Chiho-san. Kiba smiled his prince smile. With Akino-senpai, cleaning up the remaining servants will be relatively simple. Yes, Akino said, as her eyes gained a strange gleam. Chiho visibly shuddered as she felt a cold chill right up her spine. The black-haired girl licked her lips as she surveyed her new opponents with barely contained glee. You go, Abe, but you. Leave these lowly servants to me. Why, yes, Akino-senpai. Chiho muttered as she slowly stood and began stumbling her way towards the rooftops where Rias awaited her. Slowly? The drill-haired girl repeated, her expression turning dark. Raa, Akino giggled. Did I stutter? You truly have no idea who you're dealing with, do you? The girl questioned, her face going blank. Her comrades seemed to shuffle about awkwardly as they glanced at one another with nervous expressions on each of their faces. Truthfully, no, Kiba said, raising his sword once again. But nor do we care. Okino finished, lightning crackling at her fingertips. I see, the blonde girl sighed. Then you're even bigger fools than I first took you for. Carlo, man, Isabella, Mihi. Kill them. I'd rather not get their blood on my dress. As you wish, Ojusama. The three older girls said in near unison. I am here, but you, Chiho said as she stepped out onto the school roof. Before her were Rias and Asia with their backs turned towards her. Glancing over their shoulders, Chiho saw a Razor Phoenix standing across from them. However, his once overbearingly arrogant sneer had been replaced with an intrigued expression as he stared them down, Chiho in particular. Well, when I suggested this raiding game, I certainly wasn't expecting the Sakura to be one of your servants, the blonde man said smoothly. As I'm aware, she's been a devil for less than a month, correct? The fact that she's come this far is a feat in itself. Why, thank you, Razor, Ria said, with a heavily exaggerated bow. I assure you that your words of praise mean the world to me. Yes, Razor continued as though she hadn't spoken. It is quite extraordinary. His face took on a familiar smirk. She will make a fine addition to my harem, as will the rest of your peerage. Taiko visibly recoiled in disgust, and Ria's face contorted in fury. You won't lay a hand on them, Razor, she snarled. I'll make sure of that personally. Razor snorted. I will be interesting to see you try. Go on, love, put on a good show for me. How dare you? Ria shrieked as a dark, muddy aura-like energy began to radiate around her right hand. With a look of fury on her face, the crimson-haired girl hurled the gathered energy at the smug man, who simply watched it hurtle towards him. Taiko flinched slightly as he was engulfed in an explosion. Rias frowned tightly as the smoke cleared. Razor stood before them, an amused smirk on his face. Come, Rias, the man chuckled. Surely that isn't the best you can do? The Grimmery heiress let out another enraged snarl as she began hurling more bolts of destruction magic at him. Some of them, Razor blocked with magic, but most of them he allowed to strike him only for his regenerative magic to heal him almost instantly. Razor said, dusting his clothes off after his body finished regenerating. Perhaps the crimson-haired ruined princess isn't all that she's cracked up to be. He gave her a critical once-over. I have to wonder, are you even worthy of being my wife? Why you? Taiho watched in growing concern as Ria seethed. She was behaving much more irrationally than she normally would. Was this because of Razor's influence, or the stress of the game? Well, if you're quite done, Razor continued, his voice somehow becoming even more haughty than it was before. Then I'll be making the next move. Hiya! A high-pitched cry of pain startled both girls. Riaz and Chivo both spun around to see Asia slump to the ground. But what really caused a pit to form in Chiho's stomach was just who exactly was standing over the blonde nun's body. Yo, Shulan grinned. Did you miss me? Carla Man grunted as she and Kiba crossed blades once again. The two had been going at it for several minutes now, with either side able to gain the upper hand. Across the courtyard, Okano was attempting to fend off Mihi's magical attacks while dodging Isabella's physical assault. These two can work in astonishing harmony, the black-haired girl thought. She quickly ducked beneath a right hook from Isabella. The ROOK saw her opening and brought her knee up to slam it into Akino's face. But Ria's Quen had foreseen this as well. The moment she ducked, she'd also unfurled her wings and used the updraft to carry her backwards. She heard Kiba grunt and felt him land with his back facing hers. All right. They're better than I thought they'd be, Akino murmured. Do you think we can defeat them? The blonde boy asked. If you foo, I never said we couldn't, the girl replied, a dangerous gleam in her eye. I just said they performed better than I expected. Do you still mock us? Carlo Man frowned. She's bluffing, the drill-haired girl scoffed. She just can't accept that they've lost. The ho-ho, Okino giggled, but her eyes were hostile. And what makes you say we've lost? The blonde girl merely smirked. This. Ria's grimace. 1 bitch 0p has retired. Graphia's emotionless voice said over the intercom, Basha-chan, Basha-san, your healer is gone. The blonde girl laughed. And you left your king alone with only an exhausted PAWN for backup. But you? Akino whispered. Akino-senpai, Kiba muttered, his grip on his sword tightening. We need to end this. Now? Yes, the black-haired girl said softly. We do. I didn't think I'd have to do it, but given the circumstances, senpai? The boy questioned. Akino smiled mysteriously. Just stand back, Kiba-kun, she said, as she slowly began flying upward until she was several meters above ground. Prepare yourselves. The blonde girl barked. Mihi, Isabella and Carloman began spreading out in anticipation for Akino's attack. The black-haired Miko raised her arms until they were perpendicular to her body. Her eyes slowly fluttered shut as she began murmuring under her breath. Those below watched with mounting anticipation as lightning began to amass around her body, almost like a second skin. Mahi! The blonde shouted once again. Take her out, quickly! The kimono-clad gorilla nodded and raised her arms to begin channeling a spell. Only to shriek in agony as a bolt of black lightning fell from the skies. Mahi! Isabella roared, but her voice was drowned out by the shrieking whine of electricity as black lightning fell off Aikino's body in waves. Fiba had run towards a nearby stone overhang the moment Aikino asked him to stand back and could only watch the ensuing chaos and barely concealed all. Aikino's body had become a whirlwind of dark electric energy, with lightning erratically lashing out every which way. Those below her had no chance as the black-haired Maiko unleashed her ultimate attack. Fib covered his eyes as a stray bolt of black lightning struck the ground, throwing an enormous amount of dust into the air. Immediately, the airborne dust was struck by lightning and created gigantic crystalline formations. Finally, after what seemed an eternity, Akino's attack faded away and the black-haired girl fell to the ground below. Akino-senpai! Kiba shouted as he rushed to the older girl's side, carefully weaving his way through the crystal formations. Era, Akino chuckled weakly as he knelt by her side. I guess I overdid it. What was that? The blonde boy asked in mild awe. That is the ultimate technique Oshiya-sensei taught me, she smiled proudly. The polar opposite of my father's holy lightning. It's called Chaos Bolt. It was amazing. Kiba shook his head with a wry smile. Well, sensei asked that I only use it in emergencies, Akino coughed. As you can see, I takes up nearly all my power just to use it once. I took them out. Right. I think Grafia was just about to announce it. Right on cue, the silver-haired woman's voice spoke over the intercom. Razor Phoenix's one Bishop Prukan King T have retired. Perfect, Kiba smiled. Akino, however, frowned. Wait, she whispered, one bishop. But what about the black-haired girl was cut off as her body was suddenly engulfed in flames? Kiba instinctively leapt back in shock. Akino-senpai. He shouted as the older girl's screams of agony slowly faded away. Ria's Gremry's 1Quen has retired. Griffia's voice, somewhat strained, said over the intercom. Humph, a dark voice scoffed from somewhere above Kiba. The blond boy looked towards the voice numbly. He stared in shock as the drill-haired girl flew several yards above him, wings of pure flame jetting from her shoulder blades as she stared down her nose at him. Why you but what? Kiba muttered, staring at her wings. Cool, the girl spat. You truly have no idea who I am, do you? My name is Revel Phoenix. Revel Phoenix? Indeed, the blonde girl smiled coldly. I am a daughter of Clan Phoenix. Did you honestly believe I would allow a low-born monkey like her to defeat me? Don't speak that way about Akino Sanapi, Kiba snarled, snapping out of his daze after hearing the insult to his comrade. Oh, Revel giggled. The monkey doesn't like it when I insult his friends. You smash me now? How primitive. Did you see it as the drill-haired girl belittled him and his precious friends? He drew his sword. Come down here and face me, coward. Pavel cocked her head in him. But why would I do that? She questioned. This is good training for you. Once Anisom finishes with your king, you'll have to get accustomed to looking up at your superiors. Fibbo opened his mouth to retort, but the blonde girl merely laughed as she slowly descended to the ground. Oh, calm down. She smirked. I'll play with you. You'll have to get accustomed to that as well. I can't wait to put you in a dress and march you across the front lawn. Perhaps this won't be quite as fun as you envision it, Kiba said lowly, reaching into his pocket and retrieving a small vial. The smirk on Ravel's face didn't disappear, but it faded slightly. You still have your phoenix tears? The blonde asked as Kiba downed the liquid in a single gulp. The blonde swordsman smirked as his injuries were healed and shifted his stance. I'm just getting started, he growled. Good, Ravel said simply as her hands were enveloped in flames. You'll need all the help you can get. Kiba said nothing and leapt at her. This is bad, Kellwarner muttered as they watched Kiba and Ravel clash. Yuma and Middlet had left several minutes ago to go see Asia in the medical ward. Indeed, Issei murmured. He turned to Ishaya, who simply stared at the screen blankly. Conversely, I'm impressed that you managed to teach Ikano your Chaos Bolt in such a short amount of time. It's easy when a student is eager to learn, the white-haired man said softly. When I mentioned it was the polar opposite of Barakriel's Holy Lightning, she was extremely enthusiastic about it. Issei could easily discern the subtle jab at Rios. That stubborn streak seems to run in the family, doesn't it? He asked dryly. Her brother was worse, if I recall, Issei chuckled slightly. He took a glance at the door, something Issei took note of. Worried about your pupil? He asked. The white-haired man didn't respond. Then go see her. She'll want to see a friendly face when she wakes up. Ashia shook his head. My place is at your side, Issei-sama. The brunette drawled his eyes. Do I have to force you? He smirked slightly. He turned and exclaimed, Hey, Kellwarner, causing the white-haired man's eyes to widen. Be a dear and escort Ashia to the infirmary, would you? The blue-haired woman nodded. She walked over and grasped the man by the arm and began dragging him out the door. Ashu glanced over his shoulder, throwing his master a look of betrayal before the door was shut behind him. Issei chuckled for a moment before a glance around the room sobered him once again. Most of its occupants had cleared out to go attend to the raiding game's casualties. The only ones left watching were himself, Mordred, and Suzuki. But then again, those two were the least likely to go check up on their pupils even if they were defeated. Sona and Tsubaki were in a corner, speaking to each other in hushed tones and glancing at the screen every few minutes. Raythea was still sitting in front of the intercom, ready to announce a winner any moment now. Issei tore his gaze from her and back to the large television screen, where Riaz was still bombarding Razor in a flurry of destruction magic, only to have the man regenerate moments later. His eyes wandered over to another screen where Kiba was desperately dodging Ravel's fiery blasts. Finally, His eyes found the smallest screen where Chiho was getting thrown around like a rag doll by Shulin. Their chances were getting bleaker by the moment. "This fight is over," Suzuki said in a surprisingly soft voice. It was over the minute Rios made her move, Mordred grunted, though it lacked any of its usual bite. "She pressed the attack far too early," Issei agreed. "But even I wasn't expecting another Phoenix to be in Razor's peerage." "That is Razor-sama's younger sister, Ravel Phoenix," Grafia told them. "She is a high-class devil. Though she has little experience, her regenerative abilities and skill with pyrokinetics put her on par with Razor's Quen, Ubeluna." Grafia turned towards the screens once again and winced. "Rias Grimaris 1KNIGHT has retired." "I see," Issei muttered. "A possibility we should have accounted for." "Too late for should-haves," Mordred said as she slowly stood and stretched. "It's just a matter of what now." "Yes," Suzuki muttered. "What do we do now?" "Nothing," Issei said softly. His servants turned to him in surprise. "Ria's made a deal with the Phoenix clan. She has to uphold her end of the bargain. There's nothing more that I can do for her." "So that's it?" Mordred asked, crossing her arms. "You're just gonna give up?" "Believe me, there's nothing more I would like to do than storm in there and defeat Razor myself," he replied, his voice still muted. "But I have to consider the consequences of such actions. I've kept myself hidden for 1,000 of years, Mordred. Rias Gremris 1PAWN has retired. Is this really worth sending the underworld, and on a greater scale, the entire world, into chaos?" Issei asked softly. "I care for Rias, but is it really worth the possibility of damning the world to save her?" His voice trailed off as Sona and Tsubaki rushed out of the room to get to the infirmary. "Didn't stop you from saving Gabriel," Suzuki said. Issei flinched, but the black-haired girl either didn't notice or didn't care. "And it didn't stop you from saving any of us either. Rios Gremry has been defeated. Razor Phoenix wins." "I just don't know," Issei said quietly. "Whatever you choose," a voice called out. "We'll follow you, Issei-sama." The brown-haired boy turned to see as she is standing behind them. Tamamo stood at his shoulder, sending him an encouraging smile. Morgiana nodded at him solemnly. Cowherner and Mitlet stood off to the side, waiting for his response. Yama strode over and gingerly wrapped her arms around his shoulders. "We'll support you too," she said once she pulled away. Issei gazed at them all for a moment before turning to Mordred and Suzuki. "Do you really have to ask?" the blonde knight grumbled. The ninja simply shook her head, an amused smirk on her face. Issei chuckled for a moment. "Thank you? Well, isn't this a great atmosphere?" A voice Issei hadn't heard in quite a while suddenly called out. The Bruna turned his gaze towards a red transportation circle as it materialized on the floor. Rafi immediately stood and bowed as a tall, red-haired man appeared in the circle, a bright smile on his face. "I'm glad I chose just the right moment to show up," he said cheerfully. "You damn brat," Issei growled, though his tone was affectionate. "Just had to get the last word in, didn't you?" Grifia turned to him, her gaze livid. "You dare." She was silenced, however, by the red-haired man himself. "Mayu-sama?" she questioned, shocked. Sergius shook his head and chuckled before turning and grinning at him cheekily. "It's been a long time, hasn't it, Sensei?" Chapter 18. Some years ago, Issei carefully observed his student as the crimson-haired boy lazily moved his knight across the board. Behind them, a fire danced in the fireplace, illuminating the room with its glow. "Tell me, boy," he began, gesturing towards the chessboard before them. "Among these pieces, which is the most important?" "The king, of course," the young, red-haired man replied with ease. "Why do you say that?" "Once you have lost your king, you have lost the match. And the queen?" "What about the queen?" "The queen can move horizontally, vertically, and diagonally as many spaces as she wants. The queen is the most powerful piece on the board." "But when you've lost your queen, you are still in the game," Sergius retorted. After a moment, he added, "Like you and I, really." Issei raised his eyebrows with interest. "Go on." "My family status gives me great power and flexibility on the board, whereas you who cannot interfere have next to none. Yet if you were to fall, all would be lost." He emphasized this by capturing his teacher's rook, moving his queen into a vulnerable spot in the process. Are you saying that your loss will not affect the outcome? Issei asked as he captured Sergic's queen with his bishop. You have less power without the queen, the Reeded nodded, quickly avenging his fallen piece. But as I said before, you are still in the game. Interesting, the former demon king chuckled. How very interesting. And what are your thoughts, sensei? Sergic has drawled, withholding a smirk. Which is the most important piece? At that moment, however, Sergic has caught his mistake as Issei moved his pawn into checkmate. Every piece is equally important, he replied. Present, Grafia could only stare at the two men in mute shock as they began exchanging pleasantries. It's only been about 50 years, give or take, Issei questioned with a shrug. I believe the last time we were all together was at the end of the Human War, Ashia remarked. London, I believe. Correct, Tamamo smiled, reaching up on the tips of her toes to ruffle the redhead's hair playfully. Good to see you again, Setchis-chan. Sergic chuckled briefly, a positively radiant smile on his face. Tomomo, he nodded. Morgiana, Suzuki, Mordred. Ashia-sensei. It's good to see you all. Brat. Mordred smirked. Morgiana smiled at the man warmly, while the black-haired ninja merely nodded at him. Wait a moment, Grafia said abruptly. Mayusama, who are these people? Sergic chuckled, shaking his head in amusement. Grafia, I'd like you to meet my sensei, he said. He has been my mentor since I was just a boy. He goes by many names, but you know him best as our king. Our king? Grafia repeated. Slowly, her eyes began to widen as she turned to the brown-haired boy in shock. You can't possibly mean the silver-haired maid went silent as her husband leaned forward, dipping his head towards the supposedly younger man in a very formal bow. Get up, brat. Esiel sighed. I haven't been a king for a long time. He turned towards Grafia, a bemused smile on his face. Sorry. Grafia, you are his lover, correct? Thank you for taking care of this brat. He can be quite the handful sometimes. The woman merely stood, staring at him with eyes the size of saucers. Finally, after several moments, she seemed to remember herself. In a single fluid motion, she took to one knee, dipping her head towards him submissively. My king, she whispered. Please forgive my earlier insolence. It's just, how is this possible? I'm afraid it's a very long story, the brunette said wearily. One I'd rather not tell at the moment. Now, please stand. As I said before, I am no longer a king. Of course, Grafia murmured, my apologies. She proceeded to rise and stand behind Sergic, her head still bowed. Now Issei began. As pleasant as this reunion is, I hardly imagine that it's the sole reason for your visit. Perceptive, as usual, Sergic laughed. You sure haven't changed, sensei. He was quick to sober, however. Yes. A reunion was not the only reason I've come to see you, today of all days. I can only presume it has something to do with Ria's engagement? The brown-haired boy questioned. Or perhaps her performance in the raiding game? The former, Serge has nodded. While her performance was rather underwhelming, it's not the reason I wished to speak with you in private. Well? Mordred demanded. Get on with it, brat. Despite the blonde knight's impatient demands, Sergic took a moment to collect his thoughts. As you know, Riaz is less than thrilled by this engagement, he said after a while. It wouldn't be a stretch to say that she's appalled by it. What makes you say that? Suzuki asked ironically. Her desperate attempts to escape it through a raiding game, or the frothing, incoherent shrieks of rage as she tried to blow her fiancé up? Sergic has ignored her sarcastic remarks and instead focused on his teacher. I've tried to protect her, but the elders remain steadfast in their course, he said softly. The pillars are slowly dying out. The elders are desperate to continue the family lines and the gifts you bestowed upon them. Issei remained silent as Sergic went on. They insist on binding her to that pig, Razor Phoenix, the red-haired man spat with startling ferocity. You've seen the way he treats those he sees as inferior. I refuse to let that happen to my precious Amato. I'd take a bath in holy water before letting her marry that little bastard. The brown-haired boy stared at him for a long while. There was truly only one thing he could say in this situation. Siskin? Siskin? Tamamo agreed, and here Siskin, Morgiana corrected. Sergius glared at them, an affronted look gracing his face. So what if I miss Siskin? He demanded, puffing his chest out in pride. What's wrong with caring for my precious Amato, lovingly covering my bedroom walls with her photos? There were so many things wrong with that statement, Middle muttered. Pal Werner, meanwhile, turned towards Grafia with raised eyebrows. Does he really do that? I've managed to confine it to our closet, the silver-haired maid said. But yes, he does, and you're hardly one to talk, Sergius continued, pointing an accusatory finger towards a surprised Issei. You were a Siskin since before I was even born. He's got you there, master, Mordred said with a grin. She was very much enjoying this conversation. Yep, Suzuki nodded. Siskin? Yuma piped in, a teasing smirk on her face. Damn it! Issei snapped, I'm not a Siskin. Meanwhile, Grafia merely stared at the brown-haired boy doubtfully, a sweat drop making its way down her cheek. Was this really the king of demons? Anyway, Issei sighed, rubbing the bridge of his nose. Back to the situation at hand. While I can understand your distaste with the arrangement, there's little we can do at this point. The moment she agreed to the raiding game, Riaz entered a binding contract. The only way it could be annulled is if the clan elders or Razor himself decides to revoke the agreement. There is one thing, the red-haired man said calmly. No, the brunette cut in, a stern glare in his eyes. I recognize that look in your eye, brat. This isn't something you can muscle your way into. It's the only way, Sergius retorted. Issei released an aggravated sigh, rubbing his temples in an attempt to soothe his irritation. Brat, he finally growled, you've come a long way, and you've become a fine devil. But in so many ways, you're still the same, scrawny brat I found collapsed on the side of the road. Your leader, Sergius, is she or broken? As such, this needs to be dealt with in a delicate manner. What you're suggesting is that you force Riaz or the elders to comply with your wishes, which is a serious abuse of power, Issei continued for him. Realize that wars have been started over things like this. Think before you act. As you should know, there has been growing dissent over your leadership in recent years, Ashishia said. Assent? Call Warner repeated, a surprised look on her face. Tamamo? Issei prompted, waving his hand. The shadowy faction has been gaining traction as of late, the fox girl reported crisply. They call themselves the Old Mao faction. They seek to oust the current government and re-establish the rightful rulers of the underworld. The Old Mao? Middle tasked incredulously. Do they have anything to do with the Cows Brigade you told us about? Yuma questioned. That I don't know, Tamamo shook her head, but the fact remains that it's Setch's-chan plans to coerce the Phoenix clan into annulling the marriage. The old Mayu faction would use it as a catalyst to incite rebellion against the current Mayu, Warner said, realization dawning on her face. And of course, there are still those who support the current government, as she explained, which would throw the underworld into civil war once again. Issei finished an unamused scowl on his face. I am aware of this, Sergius said calmly. And, the brunette demanded, are you really willing to drag your people into another bloody war if it means saving Riaz? The red-haired man said, his voice resolute. Then yes. Do Issei just stared at him incredulously? You just don't get it, do you? I get it just fine, Sensei, Sergius said. I'm just doing what I believe is right. You should understand. After all, you're the one that taught me to always follow my heart because you've got a heart of gold, Issei finished for him with a sigh, rubbing his forehead wearily. But I also remember telling you that you've got a head full of lead. Perhaps not as full of lead as you think, Sensei, Sergius has offered with a chuckle. Because the way I see things, we have a second option. One that covers all of our bases. And what would that be, my favorite student, for you to annul this farce of a marriage? The redhead said. There was silence for several long moments in which the two parties merely stared at each other, one patiently and the other in shock. Excuse me? Only you command the sheer adoration and respect necessary to accomplish this without bloodshed, Sensei, the crimson-haired man elaborated. Do you understand what you're asking me to do? Issei questioned, a single eyebrow raised. Yes. Then you realize, he continued, his voice beginning to rise, that my resurfacing would send the angels and fallen angels into a panicked frenzy, very well sparking a second great war. Have you ever heard the term out of the frying pan and into the fire? Because that's exactly what you're suggesting we do. Is one girl, even if it is your sister, really worth that to you? Every piece is equally important. Don't throw my lines back in my face, boy, the brunette snapped. I have the resources necessary to keep your resurfacing from becoming known to them for several years if need be, sensei, Sergius said. Wait one damn minute, Issei broken. Your great master plan is to try breaking it to them slowly. The brunette sent his pupil a look that clearly said, are you fucking stupid? It may not be the greatest plan, Sergius said, ignoring his teacher's indignant cry of no shit. But it's the only plan I have. The man took a glance at the clock on the wall. I'm afraid we'll need to cut this meeting short, he said apologetically. I'm expected elsewhere. Grafia, he turned to his wife. I'd like for you to stay here and assist sensei in any way necessary. Treat his orders as though they were mine. Very well, Mayu-sama. The maid bowed as a red transportation circle appeared on the ground behind him. Sergius? Issei snapped, his voice harsh. I'm sorry, sensei, the man smiled tiredly, but I'm at the end of my line. So if you won't do anything, I will. And with that parting statement, Sergius has stepped into the circle, disappearing from the room in a flash of red light. Wow, Mordred said after several moments of silence. The brat is blackmailing you, or exacting you? Something like that. Either way, I didn't think he had it in him. He's bluffing, he has to be, Calawarner spoke up, a nervous look on her face. I don't claim to know what is going on through my husband's mind, Grafia said softly, but when it comes to his sister, he doesn't bluff. I'm beginning to think that stubbornness is the true ability of the Gremory clan, Issei scowled heavily. But now Issei-sama? Ashiya questioned. The same thing we always do, Ashiya, try to take over the world? Suzuki asked, raising an eyebrow. No, Issei snapped. And stop watching old cartoons. No, we need to deal with this subtly. He paused for a moment. But first, there's something I need to do. Riaz was silent as she sat in the infirmary, the jarring sound of hard monitors haunting her as she looked over the broken bodies of her servants. She had failed them. Each of her servants had gone above and beyond all for her sake, and yet when the time came for her to step up, she had faltered. The crimson-haired girl flinched as she heard a kennel release a moan of pain. The healers had spent well over an hour attempting to repair the damage inflicted by the female phoenix. And while the worst of it was healed, the black-haired girl still found great difficulty in moving. Her eyes wandered towards Kiba, surrounded by healers as they worked their magic. On the bed next to him, Kaneko lay sleeping. Thankfully, Tamamo had come in earlier and performed a healing to repair her destroyed muscles. Now, the white-haired girl was simply sleeping off Jack or exhaustion. Riaz turned her gaze towards Asia, who was still unconscious. She wasn't sure what Shulin had done to her, but the healers didn't seem too concerned, instead focusing their efforts on Kiba and Taiho. Her adorable little PAWN had truly come into her own. When Riaz had first turned her into a devil, she had to admit that she'd been slightly disappointed with the girl's performance. She never could have imagined that this tiny girl wielded so much power. She'd been Ria's shining star in the game, and it was for this reason Riaz felt she'd failed Shio the most. The brown-haired girl had worked so hard, and Riaz wasn't able to pull through. She had humiliated herself, her servants and her family. And now she had doomed herself and her peerage to servitude under Razor Phoenix. The red-haired girl felt a lump rise up in her throat at the thought. Tears began to prickle in the corner of her eyes, but she held them back. She would not cry, not over this. She was Rias Gremory. She would hold her head high and face her fate with pride befitting her station. Just as she finally began to regain her composure, the door to the infirmary opened and a familiar brown-haired boy stepped in. Rias, Issei said quietly as he approached her. Issei-kun, Rias stood and faced him. To his surprise, she tipped forward and entered a low bow. I'm sorry. Sorry? He questioned, a bemused smile on his face. What for? I failed you, the girl elaborated, still bowing. I promised you that we would beat Razor. I asked you to train us? And for a week you did. For a week, I thought I had a chance. Issei began as the girl's voice began to crack. You told me, she continued, still refusing to look him in the eye. You told me over and over that strength alone would get me nowhere. But I didn't listen. I want to say I'm sorry. Sorry for wasting your time. He said more firmly this time, there's no need to apologize. When the student fails, it is the fault of the teacher. But she was silenced as Issei placed a hand on her head. Rias blinked in confusion as a strange sensation washed over her. What was that? I cast a disillusionment charm over us, he replied as he leaned back, taking a seat on a nearby infirmary bed. I can see that you have a few things you'd like to let out. This way, no one will see. Immediately, she stiffened up. There's nothing to let out, Issei-kun. The boy let out a sigh. Of course there is, Rias, he said. You're being forced into marriage with someone you despise with all your being. You're hurting, Rias. I can see it as clear as day. I'm not hurting, the girl snapped. I am a gremry. Once again she was silenced, but this time by a flick to the forehead. I believe I've already told you, Issei said, a small smile on his face. That I don't care that you're Rias of the gremry. I look at you now and all I see is a girl that is about to fall apart at the seams. But Arias felt the lump in her throat rise up again, the tears prickling in the corner of her eyes. No one is watching, he said softly. It's just you and me. It's okay to cry every now and then. Rias stared into his eyes, his smile engulfing her with its warmth. The dam broke. All the anger, fear and humiliation rose up in glorious tears. She let out a choked sob as her knees began to buckle. Issei quickly reached out and steadied her. Rias didn't resist, instead latching herself onto him, burying her face in his chest as her entire body was racked by sorrow. Why? She cried softly. Why does this have to happen? Issei had no answer. He just wrapped an arm around her back to steady her, and used the other to gently caress the back of her head. Finally, after several moments of comfortable silence, Rias pulled away from him. Wiping her eyes, she gave him a small smile. I needed that, she said quietly. Thank you, Issei-kun. I wish I could do more, he replied, just as quiet. You've already done more than I could ever ask for. Rias took a look at the clock on the far wall. I should go. My family wished to speak with me. Issei simply nodded, releasing his spell and allowing the girl to step away from him. I'm told that the wedding will take place tomorrow at noon. At soon? He asked, stunned. Believe me, I was just as shocked. Rias shook her head wryly. Apparently they've been preparing for quite some time. She gave him a small, sad smile. It would mean a lot to me if you could attend. I will. But the smile still plastered on her face. The crimson-haired girl walked away until she stood near the center of the room where a red transportation circle suddenly came to life. Rias? He called when she stepped into the circle. The girl looked back at him in surprise. You're not alone. The look of surprise quickly turned to gratitude. Promise you'll be there? I promise. With that said, and with one final smile, the girl teleported away. Issei sat in silence for several moments before getting up and walking towards the door. Waiting for him on the other side were his servants, the fallen angels and Graphia. Sorry for the wait, the boy said, allowing them inside. You've concluded your business then, Issei-sama? Ashiya questioned as rest. The group began to file in. Indeed, Issei nodded. So what now? Mordred asked, crossing her arms. For now you will remain here, he replied. Ria's servants will need to be informed of what has transpired when they wake up. I'm sure they'd rather be told by friendly faces than by the healers. He then turned towards the pink-haired girl standing next to him. Tamamo, I'd be grateful if you could check up on them as well, make sure nothing is wrong. As you wish, the kitsune bowed. And what will you are doing in the meantime, master? All of this originated from one source, Issei explained. Ashiya and I will be confronting this source. May I ask how you intend to do this, Mayu-sama? Graphia questioned. That's where you come in, Graphia, The brown-haired boy smiled. I need you to take us to Castle Gremory. Gremory was a name that was well known throughout the underworld. They were known for their great power, and with that power came great wealth and prestige and responsibility. But let's not focus on that. Their family owned a large strip of land approximately the size of Honshu, and situated at the very center of it was the magnificent Castle Gremory. With its high, grandiose towers and sweeping flying buttresses, it was the embodiment of classic Gothic architecture, and while its exterior was certainly glorious to behold, its interior was just as magnificent. Ornate stained glass windows illuminated its richly decorated rooms and hallways with dappled light. It was through one of these hallways that a woman made her way towards her bedroomers. Gorgeous. This was the only word to describe her, as she elegantly glided through the halls. She had long fiery hair that cascaded past her hips and framed a heart-shaped face. Bright crimson eyes reflected the fading light as the sun slowly set on the horizon. The woman wore an elaborate black robe with a long, sweeping cape. On her feet was a pair of black boots and on her arms, elbow-length gloves, and adorning her hair was a crown that resembled a pair of bat wings. Rounding a corner, the woman came across two maids chatting in the hallway. Immediately, her beautiful face was marred with a sneer. Blazing about, are we? Her voice was calm, but it had the desired effect. The two females let out a panicked squeak before bowing to her. Then, mistress, they cried in unison. It's not that we were just for this any other day, I'd have you flogged. Mistress, please. Silence, the two immediately quieted, visibly shaking in fear. Thankfully for you, I am in a forgiving mood. Damn, mistress! Get out of my sight! Not even sparing them a second glance, the woman glided past them towards her room. Once she was out of sight, the two maids let out a relieved sigh. That was close, one of them said. I thought she'd beat us where we stood. Her friend shuddered. I wonder why she was so forgiving today, haven't you heard? Lady Ria's lost her rating game. She'll be wed to raise her phoenix in less than 24 hours. Really? No wonder, she's been trying to set them up for years now. Poor girl. I heard the phoenix boy is a real prick. Oh well. At least it got us out of another punishment. The two friends shared a laugh as they began making their way back to the servant quarters. Down the hall, the woman made a mental note to have both of them flogged. A simple spell allowed her to hear their every word. With a cold smile, she opened the door to her bedroomers and stepped inside. Immediately she froze as the entire room was suddenly cloaked in shadows. Behind her, the door closed and locked itself with a decisive click, bathing the entire room in absolute darkness. The woman grit her teeth as she felt a powerful barrier erect itself over the room. Step out of the shadows and show yourself, coward! The woman barked. Suddenly one of the candles on the wardrobe beside her sparked to life with an eerie blue flame. Her gaze fell on the candle and her eyes widened in shock. One by one, the candles lining her bedroomers came alive, bathing the entire room with their unsettling blue glow. It's been a long time, Lasara, a deep rumbling voice called out to her as a tall figure stepped out of the shadows. Hellfire, the woman murmured. The fairy tales are true, then? The angel wench cooled your wrath and turned your hellfire blue. She smiled coldly. I preferred it when they were as black as the darkness you rule over. Her eyes fell to the figure before her, drinking in his appearance. He looked exactly the same as she remembered. Tall, well over 2 meters in height, he towered above her. Plated armor, midnight black in color, with bronze trim that glinted in the low lighting. He wore a cloak of liquid shadow that pooled around him. In place of feet were a pair of large cloven hooves, and sitting atop his black hair, like a crown, was a pair of horns. The Sarah smiled, somewhat mockingly. My king, she bowed with a deeply exaggerated flourish. You live on. Tell me, what brings you to my humble abode, tonight of all nights? Watch yourself, wench. Another voice snapped. The woman's eyes widened a fraction of an inch before she fell back into a confident smirk. Of course, she muttered. Where would our esteemed king be without his favorite lapdog? From the opposite end of the room, the white-haired demon stepped out of the shadows. Like his master, he, too, wore a dark cloak. It draped across his shoulders, concealing his form from her critical eyes. However, from beneath the cloak, an enormous scorpion-like tail rose up, twitching towards her in anticipation. The man's face twisted into a snarl as a black exoskeleton-like armor began to grow in place of his skin. His hand twitched as his fingers extended into side-like claws. "Enough, Issei," the Demon King commanded. The wide-haired man continued to glare at her, but his claws and exoskeleton retracted. His tail slowly lowered itself until it was hidden beneath his cloak once again. "As you command, Issei-sama." "Oh ho!" Lysara let out a sharp laugh, delicately covering her mouth with her right hand. "Is that what you're calling yourselves these days? It seems my grandchildren aren't the only Japanophiles." "Indeed. And how fortuitous that you would mention them," Issei said lowly. "For your grandchildren are the reasons for our appearance here tonight." The red-haired woman chuckled. "So, they've told you their little sob story, have they? What happened to you, Lysara?" he questioned, studying her. "You know that Gregor," "Do not say his name," Lysara hissed. "You know that Gregor would frown upon this," Issei continued, ignoring her enraged expression. "He valued his family above all else. You both did. What you're doing now is tearing it apart. Even if you've thrown such values away, the least you could do is show loyalty towards his memory." "Do not speak to me of loyalty," the woman roared. "Not when you abandoned us, your people." She snarled. "No," she spat. "I would have words with our king." She turned towards the towering figure once more. "Do you know of the suffering you forced upon us while you were busy doing God knows what? The humiliation we suffered at the hands of our enemies? You weren't there when the fallen angels rampaged throughout the underworld. You weren't there when they dragged him through the streets of their filthy capital. You weren't there when their holy magic tore him apart." Issei could only watch in shocked silence as she raged before him. He had not known any of this. "There was a time," Lysara continued, her voice growing cold, "when we thought all was lost. Did you know, my king? That the majority of elders died, not from battle, but of their own volition." She watched with grim satisfaction as his eyes seemed to lose focus. "That's right," she whispered. "Many of our comrades, our friends, took their own lives." "Who?" was all he asked. "There were 172 great pillars," Lysara answered quietly. "Only 34 remain." "Then the 38 that vanished," the woman simply nodded sharply. "Do not speak to me of loyalty," she repeated, but the anger was gone. In its place was sheer exhaustion. Issei was silent as Lysara collapsed onto a nearby armchair. "The servants will have noticed the barrier around my chambers," she said tiredly. "Unless you wish to reveal yourself to them, you had best leave before they attempt to force their way in." "Sei-sama," Issei said softly. "She is correct. My wards sense many of them rapidly approaching our location." Lysara made a gesture with her hand. "Grafia," she called. "I can sense you hiding in that corner. Come out." Slowly, the silver-haired maid did just that. Her eyes were wide as she did so, glancing sharply between the three ancient devils and feeling incredibly out of place. "Mistress," she said somewhat awkwardly, "please take them back to wherever it is they're staying." Grafia glanced at the two males in question. Issei nodded in place of his master, who still appeared to be lost in thought. "The declud room, if you would," the white-haired man said solemnly. Nodding, the woman stepped towards them and extended her arms. Beneath them, a bright red magic circle came to life. "Gregor and I made this clan into what it is today," Lysara said as the circle activated. "I will carry on that legacy, and I will allow no one to tell me otherwise. Not even you, my king." The trio appeared in the Occult Research Club room in a flash of red light. Silently, almost robotically, Issei sat down on one of the room's many armchairs. "Ahem," Issei cleared his throat, causing Grafia to glance at him. "I believe Issei-sama would like a few moments to gather his thoughts. I will go inform the others of what has transpired. In the meantime, would you be kind enough to brew some tea for him?" "Of course," the maid nodded. The white-haired man smiled gratefully before taking his leave. Grafia took one last glance at her brooding king before heading towards the room's kitchenette. Across the room, Issei sat alone in his thoughts as his body slowly began shifting back to his human form. Grafia strode back over a tray with a teapot and cups in her hands. I'm an even greater fool than I thought I was, he said suddenly, nearly causing Grafia to spill the tea. Now, Usama? The maid questioned after regaining her composure. I thought his eyes lost focus once more. That by hiding myself, I was protecting my people, my friends, from our enemies. Not once did I think that the ones they truly needed protecting from were themselves. Raphaeus shifted awkwardly as the now brown-haired boy let out a dark chuckle. 38, he said, absent-mindedly taking up his tea and sipping it. 38 of my closest comrades and their families dead as a result of my actions. And I imagine that's still not accounting for everyone. He let out a tired sigh as he placed his tea back on the tray. Tell me, Grafia. Yes, my king. The same noticeably flinched as she referred to him by title, but he pressed on regardless. Whatever happened to Lucinda? Grafia's eyes widened before she averted her gaze. My sister, tell me. She is alive, the maid said uncertainly. Elaborate. I think it would be best if you saw it for yourself. We still have time, Issei said, standing up. Lead the way. Very well, Mayusama. This as Issei stared at the sight before him. It was an enormous lake, its shimmering, glass-like water reflecting the moonlight above. At the center of the lake was a grand palace with a small hamlet nestled in its shadow. It was his old home. Antisla, he murmured. It had been 1,000 of years since he had last seen it, but it still looked exactly as he remembered. It's unchanged. There's a reason for that, Grafia said from behind him, and it correlates directly with my sister. She's been maintaining it. The brown-haired boy raised an eyebrow. You could say that the woman's voice once again became hesitant. Perhaps it's best if you see for yourself. Please approach the water, my king. Issei raised another eyebrow to request, but complied regardless. He took a step forward only to take an instinctive step back as a magic barrier suddenly erected itself before him. This is the Aura-lock ward, Grafia said quietly. It surrounds the entirety of the lake, barring all entry. Issei slowly approached the barrier and placed his hand upon it. According to official records, it has been in place since the final days of the Great War, Grafia explained. Since I died, he finished softly. But that is not the extent of it, the silver-haired woman continued. She made a gesture towards something at his feet. Look closely, Meo-sama. The Issei did so, crouching down at the water's edge. Through the water surface, he could make out the silhouette of a small fish. But it wasn't moving. It simply stayed in the same position no matter how long he gazed at it. He then realized that it wasn't just a fish, either. The surrounding waters were completely still, even its waves were locked in the same position. As though frozen in time. You don't mean to say, breathed, his eyes widening in shock. Despite the fact that my family erased her from the family tree, Grafia began, her voice muted, they still kept records of her. My sister was well known for her affinity with time magic. So you mean to tell me that the news of your death reached the underworld? My sister placed herself and the entirety of your estate in time-lock stasis, she said solemnly. And the Aura-lock ward ensured that only the return of Satan himself would free her. But it was thought there was no chance of my survival. I know, Grafia murmured, casting her gaze downward. My sister had effectively committed suicide. Issei felt as though he'd just been dealt a blow to the stomach. He swallowed the lump in his throat and placed his hand on the barrier once again. Lucinda, he whispered, you've been waiting for me all this time. His eyes slowly shut as he extended his aura forward. Immediately he felt the barrier waver as it resonated with him. Finally, with a great crash, the barrier shattered. The two devils were greeted by the sound of waves as time resumed its normal course over the lake. Mao-sama? Grafia questioned. He didn't acknowledge her. Suddenly, his long cloak came to life, springing up and forming an enormous pair of bat-like wings. With a single, powerful, downward thrust, he was sent rocketing forward. He vaguely registered Griffia's alarmed shout as he took off toward the palace, but he disregarded it. He reached the palace portcullis in a matter of seconds and pried them open with his bare hands. Making his way into the grand entrance hall, he wasted no time on the black marble staircase, instead flying over it and towards the audience chamber above. Landing, he threw the doors open only to immediately freeze at the sight before him. There she was, sitting atop his old throne, eyes closed, was one of his oldest servants. Slowly, he approached her, taking care not to make too much noise. With every step, he drank in her appearance. She looked exactly as he recalled her. The woman's luster silver hair fell to her shoulders, framing her delicate face perfectly. And though they were still closed, he knew her eyes were the same striking blue, he remembered. Dressed in nothing but a dark cloak, her thin, pale figure looked so fragile sitting there atop his grand throne. Finally, he reached her and gently cradled her face in his hands. Slowly, tiredly, her eyes fluttered open. Mass to her. "It's me, Lucinda," he said softly. "I'm here." "You came back," she whispered. "I knew you would." "Sure, it's all right, just relax. You're still weak from being in stasis, Master?" "Sleep, Lucinda," Issei said, smiling softly. "I'll be here when you wake up." With a tired nod, the woman fell quiet once again, the only audible noise being her slow, rhythmic breathing. Issei gently shifted her into a princess carry and stood once again. The sound of heels clicking behind him alerted him to Graphia's presence. "Mayu-sama?" she asked hesitantly, gazing at the woman in his arms. "Is that her?" "It is," Issei nodded with a nostalgic smile on his face. "I can see why you were so taken aback when we first met," Graphia noted. "We look shockingly similar. Almost identical." "Indeed," he said, shaking his head in wry amusement. "Come here. I'm going to transport us to our apartment." She did so, and in a flash of blue light, she suddenly found herself surrounded by several familiar faces. "Welcome back, Issei-sama," as she greeted them. His eyes widened, however, upon seeing the woman in his arms. "Is that?" "Yes," the boy nodded. "It's Lucinda." The mama immediately sat up in alarm. "She's weak," she said worriedly, "very weak. Her chi is barely detectable." "What happened to her?" "She just spent the last few 1,000 years in time-lock stasis," Issei replied as he gently laid her down on a futon. "You're kidding," the fox girl blurted out incredulously. "Do you realize the kind of magical fortitude you need to create and live in a stasis field that powerful?" "Yes, I do," he said before turning to his lieutenant. "Ashia, we still have spare identification papers, correct?" "Correct, Issei-sama." The white-haired man nodded. "Do you wish for me to create a new identity for her?" "Yes," the brunette said. "Oh, right," he added as the white-haired man walked off. "Tamamo?" He faced the fox girl with a look of exasperation on his face. "Make sure he doesn't pick a stupid name." "Got it?" She grinned before bouncing off to go assist the white-haired man. "Suzuki," Issei called. "Could you go gather Yuma and the other fallen angels? Emmy and her entourage as well." "All right." The ninja nodded before disappearing in a swirl of leaves. "Mordred, clean up those leaves." "What the hell?" she protested. "Why should I please?" he asked. "For me?" The blonde knight let out a loud swear, but went to retrieve the dustpan regardless, muttering obscenities about the black-haired girl all the while. Issei just shook his head in bemusement, while Graphia watched in pensive silence. Admittedly, she'd been skeptical when her husband had introduced him as the Demon King, but after witnessing everything today, there was no longer any doubt in her mind. "Now, Sama," she spoke up softly, "I imagine you have much to ponder on. If you wish, I will look after my sister in your place." Issei glanced at her for a moment before nodding. "Thank you," he said quietly before slipping out of the room, for the most part unnoticed. However, one pair of eyes did notice and followed him in concern. "Issei-sama?" a soft voice called out. The brown-haired boy, who'd been busy gazing at the stars above, turned towards the voice in surprise. "Morgiana?" he questioned as the red-haired girl flew up to the apartment rooftop to join him. "Uncle Ashia told us what happened," the red-haired girl said quietly, retracting her wings. "About what you discovered." "I'm a fool, Morgiana," Issei chuckled softly. "The king of demons, the fool king is more appropriate. I thought what I was doing was for the best, but truly, who knows what is best? Not my brother, and certainly not I. Sei-sama, they revere me as a god," he continued. "But the truth is, I am no different from them. I'm a person, just as you and the others are. I make mistakes, I get discouraged, and sometimes I give up. I feel emotions, just like anyone else: anger, happiness, love, hate, fear. Are you scared now? She asked quietly. I am. Issei nodded. More than you could possibly imagine. Things are escalating out of control. I'll admit that part of me regrets ever coming to Japan, but as bad as all this is, it's made me realize something. Realize what? At all this time, while I told myself that I was protecting them, I was running. He smiled wryly. Like a coward, I secluded myself from the people who needed me most. Even now, I don't know why I did it. Perhaps I just come to enjoy my freedom. Perhaps I just got tired of fighting, running from my responsibilities. They fell into silence as the sage trailed off. They simply sat staring at the stars above. Finally, after several minutes of silence, the red-haired girl spoke up. Then maybe it's time to stop running, she said simply. Issei chuckled. If only it were that simple. After all that's happened, how can I just return? I'm not the same person I was before, Morg. I'm not the fearsome king of demons anymore. How can I expect them to follow me? How can I expect to protect them? Say-sam, Marjana began. I have been with you from the beginning, and not once have I ever seen you as a god. I have seen you make mistakes. I have seen you get discouraged, and I've seen you give up. But none of that matters because you're right. You may have godlike power, but you're still a person, and do you know what kind of person you are? Morg. You're someone that I would follow to the deepest pits of hell and the highest peaks of heaven, she continued. Because you're the kind of person that inspires love and loyalty in all you meet. I've followed you for 1,000 of years and will continue to do so until the end, because I love you more than anything. And I love you too, Morg. He smiled at her softly. She smiled back at him but was shocked as he suddenly leaned forward, capturing her lips in a kiss. Slowly, her eyes fluttered shut as she surrendered to him. Finally, after several minutes, they broke apart. And I'm sorry for not noticing before, he whispered. Apology accepted, she whispered back, a small smile forming on her face. Siskin? IUWH. He stared at her in abject shock as she began giggling. Am I interrupting something? A voice called out. The two turned to see Suzuki balancing on a nearby telephone line. The ninja had a single eyebrow raised as she smirked at them. Suzuki? The brunette exclaimed in alarm. How long were you there? Long enough, the black-haired girl said offhandedly. Anyway, Yuma and Emi's groups are here. With that, she disappeared in a swirl of leaves once again. What the fuck? They heard Mordred's enraged shriek. I just cleaned that shit up. Well, better get back in there, Issei sighed, standing up. He reached down and pulled Morgiana to her feet. The two flew back down to the apartment and stepped in to see Ashia barely restraining the enraged blonde as she attempted to attack the ninja. A small pile of leaves on the floor was all they needed to see to understand what she was so angry about. Ice-kun, Yuma said softly, drawing everyone's attention to the doorway. I'm glad you're all here, Issei nodded. Elsil told us the story, Emi said, crossing her arms. Are you seriously going to do this? I've been deliberating on this for several hours now, he replied. And I've come to a decision. However, just as he was about to go on, a groan caught everyone's attention. They turned as one to see a silver-haired woman stirring from her place on Issei's futon. Bimi's eyes widened. Is that who I think it is? Master, she called out. I'm here, Issei said, striding over to her. Issei-sama, Ishii said, walking over with several papers in hand. I've finished creating her new identity. My new identity? The woman repeated, confusion plain on her face. You've been asleep for a very long time, Lou, Issei explained softly. For the time being, you'll need a new name to fit in with the local humans. Your family name will be Iseoi, Tamama piped in. Your given name will be Sakuya. Sakuya Iseoi? The woman repeated. Sakuya? Issei mused, repeating the name in his head several times. It means flowering night if I'm not mistaken. The boy smiled briefly. It fits. He looked down at the weakened woman. Well, Sequim-san, I don't wish to alarm you, but I'm afraid that I need to make a short trip. You're leaving? the silver-haired woman asked, reaching out to grasp his arm fearfully. Only for a short time, he whispered in a soothing voice, gently removing her hand from his forearm. I'll be back for you. I promise. So that's your decision? Amy asked coolly. You realize what this could entail, correct? I'm fully aware, Amelia, Issei replied, standing and facing her. Then, you know it is my duty to prevent another war from breaking out. The greedy girl's hair slowly began turning silver as a sword began to take shape in her hand. The entire room seemed to grow cold as the two stared at each other. Were they really going to fight now of all times? I'm not going to fight you, Amelia. Because I can't afford to have you destroy the city again, Issei snapped. That was completely different, Amy retorted, her hair returning to its reddish color. Whatever, washboard. He said this last bit under his breath. It didn't stop her from hearing him, however. What did you just call me? She roared. Emi Dano, I think there are more important matters at hand here, Suzuno said in an attempt to placate her. What could possibly be more important than this? Emi snapped, glaring at the brown-haired boy. In all seriousness, though, Issei sighed. Yes, I'm fully aware of what this entails. That's why I need your help. He turned to the room at large. All of your help. Us too? Middle asked, pointing at her fellow fallen angels. Yes. He nodded. I need the three of you to stay here and help Lucy Sakuya. He corrected himself. Fill her in on what she's missed and help her integrate into the modern world. And Issei turned towards his self-proclaimed nemesis. I'd like you to watch over them. We have yet to receive word from Azazel. Kakabeel may still be at large. And while you're doing so, contact your father. He needs to be kept in the loop. Wait one damn minute, Emi snapped. Just why the hell should I do anything you say? Please, Emi? He asked softly. I need you. The girl blinked before her face began glowing even more red than her hair. Fine. She huffed, looking away from him. Saber nodded at him solemnly. Upon my honor as a knight, I will protect them. She placed a fist against her breast. I swear it. And as for the rest of you, Issei turned to his servants. Ashaya, Tamamo, Morgiana, Mordred, Suzuki. He turned towards the window where the sun had just finished rising into the sky. A new day had begun. You're all with me? Didn't we go through this already? Suzuki asked, raising an eyebrow. Margaret nodded, crossing her arms. How many times do we have to say it? To the ends of the earth. Tamamo smiled. To the ends of time. Ashia added, always. Morgiana said simply. Then, let's go, Issei ordered, a transportation circle appearing at his feet. We have a wedding to crash. Thanks for listening to my video. Don't forget to like, share, subscribe and comment below your favorite part. Sayonara, see you in the next video.